I buried my husband 4 years ago after an empty casket funeral. But yesterday, while checking into a luxury resort, my 7-year-old son tugged my sleeve. His face was entirely drained of color as he whispered that his dad was sitting by the fountain. I turned around expecting a cruel trick of grief. Instead, I looked straight into the eyes of a ghost. My name is Paige. I am 33 years old, and the family I married into has spent the last 4 years trying to convince the world I am insane. I run a highly successful biotech visualization firm, a company I built from the ground up after my husband died. It is a detail my in-laws conveniently ignore. To them, I am just a dependent, a struggling single mother surviving on their supposed charity. I let them believe it because fighting their massive egos was exhausting, and I just wanted peace for my son. But peace was exactly what died in that lobby. The air in the Cabo San Lucas luxury resort was thick with humidity and the scent of expensive floral arrangements. I was only there because my mother-in-law Beatrice had spent 2 months emotionally blackmailing me into attending this annual memorial retreat. She claimed it was vital for my son Leo to connect with his father's memory. I was standing at the marble front desk fishing for my passport when Leo yanked on the hem of my sundress. His small hand was trembling violently. I looked down ready to ask if he needed water. But Leo was staring past the sprawling lobby bar, pointing a shaking finger toward the courtyard fountain. He told me his dad was sitting right there. I froze. A cold sweat broke across my neck. Trevor died 4 years ago in a boating accident off the coast of Florida. They never found his body, just his wrecked sailing vessel and a life jacket. I spent years in therapy processing that ambiguous grief, learning how to accept an ending without a goodbye. So when I turned my head, I fully expected to see a stranger with a similar profile, a painful but common illusion. My phone slipped from my fingers and shattered against the marble floor. It was Trevor. He was sitting at a high-top table wearing a crisp linen shirt, looking tanner and healthier than he ever had during our marriage. He was casually swirling a margarita and laughing. Sitting across from him was a stunning, heavily pregnant woman who was smiling and holding his hand. My lungs forgot how to pull in air. My brain short-circuited, unable to process the physical impossibility in front of me. I took a step forward, my entire body vibrating with shock. He must have felt my stare because he turned his head. Our eyes locked. For one agonizing second, the universe stopped. I saw the flash of absolute terror explode in his familiar brown eyes. He did not look confused. He looked caught. Trevor violently shoved his chair back, nearly knocking over his drink. He grabbed the pregnant woman by the elbow, muttered something frantic, and bolted toward the west wing of the resort. I screamed his name. It tore out of my throat, raw and desperate. I abandoned my luggage and sprinted across the lobby, ignoring the startled gasps of wealthy vacationers. I dodged bellhops and luggage carts, my eyes fixed on the hallway where my dead husband had just vanished. Before I could reach the corridor, a vice grip clamped onto my upper arm, digging manicured nails deep into my skin. The force spun me around so violently I nearly lost my footing. It was Beatrice. Her face was a mask of furious, calculated rage. Standing right behind her was Cameron, Trevor's golden boy older brother, looking perfectly composed in his designer polo. I tried to wrench my arm free, pointing wildly down the hall. I told them Trevor was right there. I told them I saw him with my own eyes, that he was alive and running away with another woman. Beatrice dug her nails in harder, leaning in close, so only I could hear the venom in her voice. She hissed at me to stop making a humiliating spectacle of myself. She said I was having another psychotic break and that I was traumatizing my own child for attention. I looked back at the lobby desk. Leo was standing exactly where I left him, crying silently, watched over by a concerned concierge. My maternal instinct warred with the absolute certainty of what I had just witnessed. I screamed at Cameron to let me go, struggling against Beatrice's grip. I yelled that Trevor was alive and that they needed to call security to stop him from leaving the property before he disappeared again. Cameron stepped forward, using his broad shoulders to physically block my path. He spoke in that condescending, soothing tone he always used when treating me like a hysterical child. He told me Trevor was dead. He said the tropical heat was getting to me and that I needed to go up to my room and calm down before they were forced to call a doctor to sedate me. I shoved Cameron hard in the chest. I was not crazy. The sheer panic in Trevor's eyes had been real. They knew. The realization hit me like a speeding freight train. Beatrice was not surprised by my screaming. Cameron was not looking around the lobby for his miraculous resurrected brother. They were not shocked. They were solely focused on shutting me up. I declared I was going to the police. I said I was getting the resort security tapes right now to prove he was here. A cold, sharp laugh cut through the humid air. Simone stepped out from behind Cameron. My sister-in-law was a cutthroat corporate lawyer, a brilliant, ruthless African-American woman who wore intimidation like a second skin. Her tailored vacation resort wear looked more like expensive armor, and her perfectly styled hair did not move an inch in the coastal breeze. She stepped directly into my personal space, her dark eyes flat and completely devoid of empathy. She smiled, but it was a terrifying predator's smile. Simone told me to take my meds. She stated flatly that dead men do not drink margaritas in Cabo. She looked down at my shaking hands, then glanced over at my crying son across the lobby. Her voice dropped to a razor-sharp whisper. She told me that if I took one more step down that hallway, or if I made one more scene in this lobby, she would have Child Protective Services here in an hour. She reminded me that she was a partner at a top law firm, and she would personally see to it that an unstable, hallucinating widow was stripped of her parental rights before sunset. The threat was a physical blow to the stomach. My breath hitched. Simone's threat was not empty. She had the connections to make my life a living hell. She knew the law inside and out, and she knew exactly how to twist it to destroy anyone who crossed her family. What Simone did not know was that the timid widow she thought she was bullying had just closed an $80 million acquisition deal last week. I was not a fragile girl drawing pictures. I was a CEO who knew how to wage war in boardrooms. I looked at Simone's deadpan expression, then at Beatrice's smug face, and finally at Cameron's impassive stance. They were a unified wall of deception. They were perfectly willing to let me believe I was losing my mind, perfectly willing to take my child away, all to protect the ghost walking around the west wing of this hotel. I stopped struggling. I let my arms fall to my sides, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I looked at my son wiping his eyes with the back of his little hand. Then I looked at the three monsters standing in front of me. I realized then that my husband did not drown. He just swam to a different life, and his family bought the ticket. The morning sun was blinding as it bounced off the turquoise waters of the resort, but I felt nothing but ice in my veins. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror in my standard hotel room, staring at my reflection. In my hand, I held a crumpled bar receipt I had found near the courtyard fountain late last night after the family had forced me into isolation. The ink was faded from the condensation of a margarita glass, but the name printed at the top was crystal clear. Trevor Vance, room 412. Vance was not a coincidence. It was my mother-in-law, Beatrice's maiden name. It was the exact same name she used for her offshore shell corporations. My dead husband was not just alive, he was funded. I smoothed down my simple linen dress, taking a deep breath to steady my racing heart. Today required a flawless performance. If Simone and Beatrice wanted to treat me like a hallucinating, grief-stricken widow, I would give them exactly what they expected. I tapped my pocket to ensure my phone was recording, took my son Leo by the hand, promising him a special morning, and walked down to the main terrace for the mandatory family breakfast. The dining terrace was crowded with the resort's elite. Wealthy investors, corporate sharks, and socialites were sipping mimosas under oversized white umbrellas. Beatrice was holding court at a massive corner table draped in silk and dripping in diamonds. Cameron and Simone were seated next to her, looking like the ultimate untouchable power couple. I kept my shoulders slumped and my gaze lowered as I approached the table with Leo. Before I even pulled out a chair, Beatrice raised her voice. She projected her words just loud enough for the neighboring tables of wealthy elites to hear. She sighed dramatically, telling her friends that it was just so tragic. She pointed a manicured finger at me, announcing to strangers that I was suffering from severe grief-induced delusions. She claimed I was struggling to separate reality from trauma, spinning a public narrative that I was a broken, unstable woman holding on to dangerous fantasies. Simone chimed in, offering a tight, patronizing smile, loudly suggesting that they might need to evaluate my living situation for Leo's safety before my mind deteriorated any further. I swallowed the absolute rage burning in my throat. I played the part, nodding meekly, looking down at my hands as if I were truly lost. I walked over to the serving station and poured a steaming cup of black coffee. Cameron was sitting at the edge of the table, his eyes glued to his phone, his thumbs moving frantically across the screen. I timed my steps perfectly. As I walked past him, I faked a stumble, twisting my wrist just enough to send the scalding coffee splashing directly across the table and onto Cameron's pristine white trousers. Cameron cursed loudly, violently, shoving his chair back and dropping his phone onto the table. The device landed face up the screen, glowing brightly against the spilled coffee. While Beatrice shrieked about my clumsiness and Cameron brushed frantically at his pants, I quickly dropped to my knees, pretending to help clean up the mess. My eyes darted to his phone screen. There was an incoming text message. The sender was saved simply with the initials TV. The message was short and frantic. It told Cameron to keep the crazy bitch away from the West Wing. Beatrice had seen enough. Disgusted by my supposed incompetence, she snapped her designer purse open. She pulled out a crisp $100 bill and threw it onto the table. She told me to take the money, take my son to the public beach, and buy him some cheap ice cream. She hissed that I was ruining their adults' networking brunch and ordered me to stay out of sight until dinner. I did not throw the money back in her face. I did not scream. I quietly picked up the damp $100 bill, apologized in a small voice, and took Leo's hand. As I walked away from the terrace, a cold, sharp smile spread across my face. Beatrice genuinely thought she was funding a charity case. She thought $100 was a flex of absolute power over a destitute widow. She was totally unaware that just last week, sitting at my kitchen island while Leo did his homework, I had finalized an $80 million acquisition deal for my biotech visualization firm. I had enough liquid capital in my personal accounts to buy this entire resort, fire the management, and evict my in-laws by lunchtime. But power is only effective when your enemies do not know you have it. Instead of heading down to the public beach, I turned my back to the ocean. I squeezed Leo's hand, telling him we were going on a secret scavenger hunt. I bypassed the main elevators and took the service stairs, moving methodically toward the West Wing. The air conditioning grew colder as we navigated the quiet, plush corridors. I stopped in front of a heavy mahogany door, number 412, the number from the receipt, the wing Cameron had been ordered to keep me away from. My pulse hammered against my eardrums. I raised my fist and knocked firmly on the wood. The lock clicked. The door swung inward. Standing in the doorway was a stunning woman with perfectly styled hair. She was heavily pregnant, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. She looked at me with polite confusion, asking if she could help me. My voice caught in my throat. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand answers, to ask who she was. But before a single word could form on my tongue, a man stepped out from the shadows of the hotel suite. He moved up behind the pregnant woman, placing a protective, loving hand on her shoulder. It was Trevor, my dead husband. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut with a sharp and final thud. The beautiful pregnant woman was abruptly shoved back inside the hotel suite, her confused voice completely cut off by the solid wood. I was standing face to face with the ghost of my husband in the brightly lit corridor of the West Wing. I braced myself for the flood of apologies. I expected tearful explanations and desperate pleas for forgiveness. I expected Trevor to fall to his knees and tell me he was forced into hiding by dangerous people to protect our family. That is the lie I would have told to soften the blow. But Trevor did not drop to his knees. He straightened his posture, ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, and glared at me. He stepped forward, trapping me against the textured silk wallpaper of the resort hallway. He looked me up and down with absolute disgust. He told me that I always had to ruin everything. The sheer audacity of his words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. There was no remorse in his familiar brown eyes. There was only deep irritation that I had interrupted his luxurious vacation. I stared at the man I had mourned for 4 agonizing years. This was the man whose absence had forced me to explain death to a toddler. Trevor crossed his arms and did not even bother to lower his voice. He arrogantly laid out the ugly truth right there in the hallway. He admitted that 4 years ago his boutique investment firm was hemorrhaging money. He was weeks away from a massive federal indictment for fraud and total financial ruin. He told me that instead of going to federal prison like a common criminal, he chose to start over. He orchestrated the tragic boating accident off the Florida coast with the full financial backing of his mother Beatrice and his brother Cameron. It was a perfectly executed exit strategy designed to leave me holding the bag. But the real mastermind, he bragged, was Simone. My ruthless corporate lawyer sister-in-law was the one who found the legal loophole to quickly declare him dead without a body. She was the one who expertly helped Beatrice launder the $10 million life insurance policy payout. They moved the cash through a labyrinth of offshore shell corporations using Beatrice's maiden name Vance to hide the paper trail. Trevor leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive tequila and fresh lime. He told me I was nothing but a naive, struggling single mother who drew pictures for a living. He openly mocked my medical visualization background, having absolutely no idea that my tiny startup was now an industry titan. He ordered me to pack my cheap bags, gather our son Leo, and crawl back to my poverty-stricken life. He warned me that if I breathed a single word of this to anyone, Simone would bury me under so much brutal litigation I would never see daylight or my son ever again. A year ago, that threat would have shattered my entire world. I would have collapsed on the carpeted floor, weeping and begging for answers. But the fragile woman Trevor left behind 4 years ago died the day she realized she had to be both a mother and a father. The woman standing in front of him now was a tested CEO who routinely crushed hostile corporate takeovers before her morning coffee. I did not scream. I did not cry. I certainly did not slap his smug, tanned face. Instead, my eyes dropped to his left wrist. Peeking out from beneath the cuff of his crisp linen shirt was a heavy platinum Rolex Daytona. It was the exact watch I had saved up for 2 years to buy him for our 5th wedding anniversary. It was the very same watch Beatrice had tearfully claimed was recovered from the boat wreckage. She told me she had buried it in his empty casket for sentimental reasons, because it meant so much to our family. Seeing it gleaming on his wrist was the ultimate proof of their sloppy and arrogant stupidity. They were so confident in their wealth and power that they did not even bother to hide the evidence. I looked back up at his face and I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp smile that did not reach my eyes. Trevor mistook my silence for submission. He assumed my smile was the broken reaction of a weak and defeated woman. He scoffed, reached into the pocket of his tailored trousers, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He shoved it hard against my chest. He told me there was $10,000 inside. He called it a generous severance package for my travel troubles. He instructed me to take the cash, keep my mouth shut, and get off the resort property before the family dinner service began. I reached up and slowly took the envelope. I felt the substantial weight of the $100 bills inside. The irony was absolutely delicious. My dead husband was trying to buy the silence of a woman who had just deposited $80 million into her corporate bank account 5 days ago. I did not say a single word to him. I gripped the envelope, turned on my heel, and began to walk down the long corridor toward the main elevators. I was already calculating my next tactical move, mentally drafting the urgent emails I would send to my aggressive legal team in New York. But as I rounded the corner to the elevator bank, my confident steps faltered. The hallway stretched out before me, entirely empty, except for one person blocking my only exit. It was Simone. My sister-in-law stood at the far end of the corridor, her posture rigid and combative. She was wearing a flawless crimson power suit, looking every bit the legal predator she was born to be. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and a smug, triumphant smirk played on her lips. In her hands she held a thick legal folder. Printed across the front of the pristine white cover in bold black letters were the words Leo Custody Petition. The harsh fluorescent light of the resort corridor glinted off the stark white folder in Simone's hands. The bold black letters reading Leo Custody Petition hit me like a physical strike to the chest. My sister-in-law stood perfectly still. Her immaculate crimson power suit contrasted sharply with the relaxed tropical atmosphere of the hotel. As an incredibly successful African-American corporate attorney, she was used to dominating every room she entered. Her dark eyes were flat and completely devoid of human warmth. She did not raise her voice. She did not have to. Simone stepped forward and snatched my wrist. Her grip was like a steel trap. Before I could call out for security, she shoved me through the heavy metal fire doors into the adjacent concrete stairwell. The door slammed shut behind us, cutting off the ambient resort music and plunging us into a suffocating, echoing silence. She slapped the manila folder against my collarbone, forcing me to take it. She told me to open it and read the front page. She said she had already drafted emergency paperwork to file with a family court judge back in our home state. She claimed she had sworn affidavits from Beatrice and Cameron, stating I was an unfit mother experiencing violent and unpredictable grief-induced delusions. She leaned in so close I could smell her expensive perfume. She told me a single phone call from her would have the local authorities escort me to a psychiatric ward in handcuffs while she legally flew my son back to the United States to live with her. I gripped the folder, my knuckles turning white. I asked her how she could possibly do this. I asked her how an entire family could fake a dead body and leave me to mourn a husband who was sitting by a pool drinking margaritas. I needed her to say it out loud. I needed her arrogance to override her legal training. Simone laughed, a sharp, echoing sound that bounced off the cold concrete walls. She was so blinded by her own superiority that she could not resist the urge to brag about her brilliance. She stepped into my personal space, boasting about her flawless legal strategy. She detailed exactly how she bribed a corrupt medical examiner in Florida to swap Trevor's dental records with an unidentifiable accident victim pulled from a different wreck. She laid out the precise timeline of filing the $10 million life insurance claim. She bragged about how easily she bypassed the federal investigators because of her pristine reputation as a partner at a top-tier law firm. She explained how she and Beatrice washed the cash through offshore shell companies under the name Vance. Simone looked down at the thick envelope of hush money Trevor had just shoved into my hands. She sneered with absolute disgust. She told me I was completely out of my league. She reminded me of my background in medical illustration, mocking the years I spent sketching anatomy for textbooks while Trevor was supposedly building an empire. She asked if I honestly thought a girl who draws doodles for a living could outmaneuver a Harvard-educated law partner. She said my entire existence was a pathetic charity case, funded by the very family I was threatening to expose. She was completely unaware that those medical illustration doodles had evolved into a proprietary biotech visualization software that was now utilized by the largest hospital networks on the globe. She did not know I was the sole proprietor of a company that had just been acquired for $80 million. I knew exactly what I had to do. If I challenged her right now in this stairwell, she would silence me before I could secure my assets. I needed her to feel absolute, undeniable power. I needed her to believe she had broken my spirit completely. So I let the envelope of cash slip from my fingers. It hit the concrete floor with a heavy thud. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I let my knees give out, collapsing onto the cold, hard floor of the stairwell. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing hot tears to spill down my cheeks. I wrapped my arms around myself and begged her. I pleaded with her not to take my son. I sobbed loudly, promising I would pack my bags, keep my mouth shut, and pretend I never saw Trevor. Simone looked down at me with supreme satisfaction. She smoothed a non-existent wrinkle from her crimson skirt. She told me to pick up the cash, wipe my pathetic face, and go back to my cheap room. She ordered me to put on whatever acceptable dress I owned and attend the family charity gala that evening. She warned me that if I looked anything less than a grateful grieving widow, she would make the call to Child Protective Services before the appetizers were served. The heavy metal fire door creaked open and slammed shut. Her sharp heels clicked away down the hallway, fading into complete silence. I sat on the concrete floor for exactly 10 seconds. Then I stopped crying. My breathing instantly leveled out. My heartbeat slowed to a calm, steady rhythm. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. I stood up and brushed the dust off my knees. I reached into the hidden pocket of my linen dress and pulled out my phone. The screen was still brightly lit. The red recording icon was actively pulsing. I hit stop and saved the 20-minute audio file directly to my secure corporate cloud server. I had Trevor's confession from the hallway, and now I had Simone detailing the exact mechanics of a massive federal insurance fraud in the stairwell. I picked up the $10,000 in cash, walking purposefully back to my room where Leo was safely watching cartoons. I locked the deadbolt, engaged the security chain, and opened my laptop. I bypassed the unsecured hotel network and logged directly into my encrypted corporate portal. I opened a secure video channel and called my lead corporate attorney in New York, a man named Miles, whose hourly rate would make Simone choke on her champagne. He answered on the first ring, looking perfectly composed in his high-rise office. I looked at the screen, my voice devoid of any emotion. I told him I needed an immediate tactical strike. I ordered him to trace the Vance shell corporations and use our newly acquired capital to freeze their offshore accounts. I told him it was time to burn their empire to the ground. I closed my laptop with a definitive snap. The encrypted video call with my New York attorney had lasted less than 3 minutes, but it was enough to set a financial nuclear bomb in motion. Miles was already tracking the offshore shell accounts Simone and Beatrice had used to launder Trevor's life insurance payout. The digital war had officially begun in the shadows, but tonight I had a very physical, very public war to fight right here in the resort ballroom. Earlier that afternoon, Beatrice had used her master keycard to barge into my cheap standard room. She had tossed a flimsy plastic garment bag onto the edge of my bed with a look of absolute disgust. Inside was a shapeless, faded beige dress that looked like it had been sitting in a mothball-filled attic for a decade. Beatrice had explicitly ordered me to wear it to the family charity gala that evening. She instructed me to stand near the kitchen doors, keep my eyes at floor level, and absolutely never speak to their wealthy investors. I was meant to play the tragic, pathetic dependent they so graciously supported. It was a calculated move to humiliate me and reinforce their narrative of my incompetence. I stared at the hideous beige fabric pooled on my bed. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. I picked it up and dropped it directly into the trash can. They truly believed I was a destitute artist who relied on their handouts. They had no idea that I had packed for a completely different kind of celebration. I walked over to my own luggage and unzipped a heavy canvas garment bag. Inside hung a breathtaking custom-made emerald green silk gown. I had purchased this $15,000 masterpiece in Manhattan just weeks ago to celebrate the massive acquisition of my biotech visualization company. It was tailored to perfection, designed to command respect in boardrooms and galas alike. I spent the next hour transforming myself. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, severe style that highlighted the sharp angles of my face. I fastened a pair of diamond drop earrings I had bought with my own hard-earned capital. When I looked in the mirror, the frightened, gaslit widow was completely gone. Staring back at me was a CEO ready to tear her enemies apart in their own arena. The resort ballroom was dripping in crystal chandeliers and towering arrangements of white orchids. A string quartet played softly in the corner, while waitstaff circulated with silver trays of champagne. The room was packed with the very elite investors and venture capitalists Cameron and Simone were trying to court for their next fraudulent real estate venture. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and stepped into the ballroom. The effect was instantaneous. The soft hum of conversation near the entrance completely died. Heads turned. Wealthy men and women stopped mid-sentence, their eyes drawn to the emerald silk, catching the light with every confident step I took. I did not slink toward the kitchen doors. I walked directly into the center of the room, my posture radiating absolute power. Across the ballroom, Beatrice was holding court with a group of older socialites. When she saw me, her jaw unhinged. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering against the polished marble floor. Simone was standing near the bar, and I watched her dark eyes narrow into dangerous, furious slits. Her perfect crimson armor seemed to bristle. They were both seething, boiling with rage, but they were completely paralyzed. They could not scream at me. They could not drag me into a stairwell and threaten my child here. They were surrounded by the exact high society investors they desperately needed to impress. Cameron, however, could not handle the shift in power. He excused himself from a circle of Wall Street titans and marched directly toward me, his face flushed red under his tan. He forced a wide, fake smile for the watching crowd, but as he reached me, his fingers clamped around my upper arm like a vice. He leaned in close, his voice a venomous whisper. He demanded to know what I was doing and where I got that dress. He called me a parasite and told me I was going to ruin their entire networking event. I smoothly pulled my arm out of his grasp, smiling radiantly for the onlookers. I told him I was simply enjoying the gala. Cameron's eyes flashed with cruel inspiration. He decided to put me in my place the only way he knew how, by publicly degrading me. He guided me forcefully toward his circle of elite investors. He introduced me to the older wealthy men with dripping condescension. He announced that I was his poor widowed sister-in-law, Paige. He spun a brief, tragic tale about how much I struggled and how his family financially carried me so I could survive. The investors offered me polite, pitying smiles. Cameron then turned to me, treating me like a hired servant. He told me to be a dear and fetch the men a round of their finest aged scotch from the bar, adding that a dependent like me should make herself useful. I did not flinch. I did not show a single ounce of embarrassment. I gave Cameron a warm, dangerously calm smile. I told him it would be my absolute pleasure. I walked gracefully to the bar, ordered 4 glasses of the most expensive scotch on Cameron's tab, and arranged them on a silver tray. I navigated back through the crowd, feeling Simone's furious gaze burning into my back. I approached the circle of men and flawlessly distributed the heavy crystal glasses. Cameron smirked, clearly satisfied with my apparent submission. He opened his mouth to dismiss me back to the shadows. Before he could speak, I turned to the lead investor, a prominent billionaire named Richard Montgomery. I extended my hand, my voice carrying clear and steady over the music. I introduced myself properly. I said my name was Paige Kensington. Richard Montgomery paused, his scotch glass halfway to his mouth. He stared at my face, then down at my extended hand. A look of profound realization washed over his features. He eagerly shook my hand, his eyes widening with absolute shock. He turned his head and looked at Cameron, his voice booming across the quiet circle. He loudly asked Cameron if he was joking. He demanded to know why Cameron was treating me like a servant. Richard Montgomery proudly announced to the entire group of investors that this was Paige Kensington. He pointed directly at me, his voice echoing over the string quartet, declaring that I was the brilliant CEO who had just finalized the $80 million buyout of Apex Medical last week. The entire circle of Wall Street titans went dead silent. The pity in their eyes vanished, replaced instantly by immense respect and awe. Cameron's smug smile evaporated. His jaw hit the floor, his face turning the color of wet ash. He looked at me as if I had just ripped the oxygen straight out of his lungs. Richard Montgomery's booming voice still echoed across the grand ballroom. The entire circle of Wall Street titans stood in stunned silence, their expensive scotch glasses hovering mid-air. Cameron was completely frozen. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly as the elite investors he had spent months trying to court suddenly crowded around me. They were eager to shake the hand of the CEO who had just executed the biggest biotech buyout of the quarter. I smiled gracefully, offering firm handshakes and fielding their excited questions with practiced corporate ease. I let Cameron stew in his profound public humiliation for exactly 5 minutes. His face had turned a sickly shade of gray, and he looked like he might physically collapse onto the marble floor. Having thoroughly dismantled his power play, I politely excused myself. I told Richard I needed to powder my nose gliding away from the networking circle with my emerald silk gown trailing behind me like liquid glass. I knew exactly who would follow. The resort's master powder room was a lavish expanse of gold-trimmed mirrors, crystal sconces, and pink marble counters. I had barely set my clutch down when the heavy double doors violently swung open. Beatrice stormed in, her face flushed a blotchy, furious red. Simone stepped in right behind her, moving with the lethal precision of a striking snake. Simone swiftly turned the deadbolt on the main door, locking us inside. Beatrice pointed a trembling, diamond-ringed finger directly at my face. She hissed that I was a pathological liar and a sociopath. She claimed I was humiliating their family by spinning insane, grandiose delusions to Richard Montgomery. She demanded I march back out to the ballroom and tell the investors I was having a mental breakdown, ordering me to say I had confused my little drawing hobby with a real business. Simone stepped in front of Beatrice, taking total control of the ambush. Her crimson suit seemed to absorb the light in the room, and she looked at me with absolute chilling disdain. She told me my little performance was pathetic. She said she did not know how I found out about the Apex medical acquisition, but pretending to be a CEO was corporate fraud. She threatened to call the local police right now and have me arrested for impersonating an executive. She smiled her terrifying predator smile, claiming an arrest record would be the perfect airtight excuse to finally take permanent custody of my son. I did not cower. I did not drop my gaze or shrink away. I reached into my clutch, pulled out a tube of lipstick, and calmly applied it while holding Simone's furious stare in the mirror. I turned around and dropped the poor, fragile widow act completely. My posture straightened, my shoulders squaring as I tapped into the exact persona I used to eviscerate rival tech executives in New York. I told Simone she was slipping. I said a Harvard-educated law partner should know better than to threaten a billionaire in a locked room. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, forcing her to hold her ground. I told her I did not just read about the Apex medical buyout. I orchestrated it. I owned the proprietary software. I built the entire empire while she and Beatrice were busy burying an empty casket. Simone let out a harsh, dismissive laugh, desperately trying to maintain her dominance. She told me I was out of my mind and that my grief had finally made me completely psychotic. So I hit her with the numbers. I looked directly into her dark eyes and recited a 16-digit routing number. I recited the exact offshore banking code. I said the name, Vance Holdings. I detailed the exact date and time 4 years ago when $10 million from a fraudulent life insurance policy was wired into a Cayman Islands account. I told her I knew she was the architect of the entire scheme. I described exactly how she forged the dental records, bribed the medical examiner in Florida, and washed the blood money through her mother-in-law's maiden name. Simone stopped laughing. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. Her confident predator stance shattered in a fraction of a second. She took a physical step backward, her back hitting the cold marble wall. Beatrice let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack, her eyes wide with unadulterated panic. I stepped closer, invading Simone's personal space, just as she had done to me in the stairwell earlier that day. I kept my voice dangerously low, stripped of any empathy. I told them my corporate attorneys in New York were already dismantling their offshore accounts. I explained that I now had access to every single fraudulent transaction they ever made. They thought they were the apex predators, but they were just sloppy amateurs playing with federal felonies. I gave them my ultimatum. I told Simone and Beatrice they had exactly 24 hours to walk into the local authorities and confess to the insurance fraud, the faked death, and the money laundering. I said if they turned themselves in, I would simply watch them burn from a distance. But if they tried to run, if they tried to move a single cent of that stolen money, or if they ever threatened to take my son away from me again, I would unleash a legal and financial apocalypse on their entire bloodline. I grabbed my clutch, unlocked the heavy powder room doors, and walked out. I left the two most terrifying women I knew trembling in stunned, breathless silence. My pulse was pounding with pure adrenaline as I navigated the winding resort corridors back to my standard hotel room. I had checkmated them. I had the recording secured on my cloud server, my lawyer was freezing their assets, and I just needed to gather Leo, pack our bags, and move us to a secure 5-star property across the bay. I had left Leo sleeping soundly under the watchful eye of a highly vetted resort babysitter, but now I just wanted him close. As I rounded the final corner to my hallway, the triumphant fire in my veins turned to ice. My hotel room door was wide open. The heavy wooden frame was splintered around the lock, completely kicked in. Panic seized my throat. I sprinted the last few yards and burst into the room. The space was completely trashed. My luggage was ripped open, my clothes scattered everywhere. I looked frantically toward the bed where I had left my son. It was empty. The babysitter was nowhere to be found. I realized with a sickening jolt that my decoy laptop was gone from the desk. The thick manila envelope holding the $10,000 in hush money was missing from the nightstand. The balcony doors were shut, and the heavy blackout curtains were drawn, plunging the room into deep shadows. A dark figure detached itself from the corner of the room. Trevor stepped into the dim light. He was breathing heavily, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked nothing like the smug, arrogant ghost I had seen in the corridor earlier today. He looked desperate and highly dangerous. He held up my smashed laptop in one hand, dropping it onto the carpet with a sickening crunch. He took a step toward me, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "You think you are smart, Paige," Trevor said from the shadows. "I just deleted everything." Trevor kicked the shattered remains of my laptop across the carpet. The metallic crunch of breaking plastic and tearing circuits echoed loudly in the dim, trashed hotel room. He stepped closer, using his physical size to cast a long, menacing shadow over me. He backed me against the heavy blackout curtains, his chest heaving with exertion. He pointed a finger inches from my face and unleashed a torrent of absolute venom. He told me I was exactly the same pathetic, naive woman he had left behind 4 years ago. He sneered that I was always too busy drawing my little medical sketches to notice his boutique investment firm was collapsing right under our roof. He leaned in closer, trapping me against the window. He called me a terrible mother. He hissed that dragging our son to Mexico just to play the grieving widow for his wealthy family was a sickening cry for attention. He bragged that he had easily slipped into my room, found my cheap computer, and destroyed the only leverage I had against him. He truly thought he had won. He thought physical intimidation and breaking a piece of hardware would reduce me to the crying, desperate wife he remembered from our marriage. He demanded I take my son, accept my miserable life, and leave the resort before he lost his temper completely. I looked down at the ruined pieces of plastic and silicone scattered across the floor. Then I looked back up into his furious, sweating face. I did not scream. I did not shrink away from his raised hand. Instead, I started to laugh. It was not a hysterical, panicked laugh. It was a deep, genuine sound of pure amusement that bubbled up from my chest and filled the dark room. Trevor froze. His hand dropped slightly. His brow furrowed in deep, angry confusion. He asked me what I found so funny about my life being ruined. I stepped away from the curtains, closing the distance between us, forcing him to step back. I asked him if he honestly believed a woman who runs an $80 million technology firm keeps her proprietary data on a local hard drive. I watched his eyes widen as the words registered. I explained that my company does not just draw pictures. We process millions of terabytes of highly sensitive patient data for global hospital networks. I told him my entire empire is built on military-grade encrypted cloud architecture. I smiled, pointing down at the debris on the floor. I informed him that the computer he had just proudly destroyed was an $800 decoy I bought specifically for travel. It held absolutely nothing of value. The smug arrogance melted off Trevor's face, replaced by a sickly grayish pallor. I kept pushing forward, my voice sharp and relentless. I told him the audio recording of his hallway confession was uploaded directly to my secure corporate server the second he walked away from me earlier today. I told him Simone's arrogant monologue in the concrete stairwell, the one detailing every single step of their $10 million insurance fraud, was sitting right next to it. I leaned in close, enjoying the sudden unmistakable smell of fear radiating off him. I whispered that my lead corporate attorney in New York had already downloaded those files. I watched his breath hitch as I delivered the final crushing blow. I told him that exactly 2 hours ago, my legal team had handed that entire digital package over to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Trevor stopped breathing. The reality of a massive federal indictment crashed down on him with the weight of a collapsing building. His knees literally buckled. He stumbled backward, tripping over my overturned suitcase, and caught himself on the edge of the mattress. The menacing, aggressive man who had just threatened me completely vanished. In his place was a pathetic, trembling coward. He held up his hands, his voice cracking as he began to beg. He started hyperventilating, pleading with me to call my lawyers and stop the federal agents. He immediately turned on his own family to save his own skin. He swore that the faked death was entirely Beatrice's idea. He practically cried as he claimed Simone had forced him to comply with the money laundering scheme, stating she was the one who threatened to ruin him if he did not go along with the plan. He insisted he was just a pawn in their corporate games and that he never actually wanted to leave me or our son. He dropped to his knees on the carpet, surrounded by the clothes he had just thrown out of my luggage. He offered me the rest of his hidden cash, begging for mercy. He promised he would disappear to a different continent and never bother us again if I just made one phone call to call off the federal investigation. I stood over him, feeling nothing but profound disgust. I watched the man I had mourned, the man I had wept over for 4 years, sob on the floor of a hotel room like a trapped rat. I told him that federal agents do not negotiate with ghosts. Before I could tell him to get out of my sight, a noise broke the heavy tension in the room. The splintered hotel door, already hanging loosely on its broken hinges from where he had kicked it in, was pushed wide open. The bright light from the hallway spilled into the dark room, illuminating the absolute destruction on the floor. Standing in the doorway was the stunning, heavily pregnant woman from the courtyard. She took in the sight of my ripped luggage, the smashed electronics, and Trevor sobbing on his knees at the edge of the bed. Her hands flew to her swollen belly, her face a portrait of pure horror. Her voice trembled as she looked at the man cowering on the carpet. She asked Trevor what was going on. She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear and deep confusion, and asked him who I was. I did not wait for his pathetic lying mouth to form an excuse. I did not give him the chance to spin another web of deceit. I turned to her, my posture perfectly straight, and offered a warm, radiant smile. I said, "Hi, I am his widow," and asked her who she was. The pregnant woman stood frozen in the doorway of my destroyed hotel room. Her hands gripped her swollen belly as her eyes darted from the shattered laptop on the floor to the overturned luggage and finally to the man she thought she knew. Trevor scrambled up from the carpet like a cornered animal. His face was entirely devoid of color, slick with cold sweat. He reached his hands out toward her, his voice pitching into a frantic high whine. He stepped over the broken electronics and tried to grab her shoulders desperately, stammering that I was just a crazy hotel guest. He claimed I was a deranged stalker who had broken into his room, and he begged her to step back into the hallway where it was safe. I did not raise my voice. I did not move from my position by the window. I simply looked at the beautiful woman and addressed her by her full name. I said, "Hello, Alyssa Bradley." Trevor froze completely. Alyssa flinched, her eyes snapping to my face. She demanded to know how I knew her name. I walked slowly across the debris-covered carpet. I told her I knew exactly who she was because I knew exactly who her father was. I explained that her father was Warren Bradley, the billionaire real estate mogul my brother-in-law Cameron had been desperately courting all weekend for a massive corporate merger. I watched the realization slowly wash over her features. I laid the ugly truth out bare in the dim light of the room. I told Alyssa that Trevor did not just stumble into a new life in Mexico. He targeted her. He built a completely fraudulent identity to infiltrate her family and marry into a fortune that would replace the one he lost to his own criminal incompetence. I explained that the man standing in front of her was not a successful entrepreneur. He was a fugitive hiding from multiple federal indictments for financial fraud. I told her he faked a boating accident 4 years ago, leaving me to raise our son alone while his family laundered a $10 million life insurance payout. Trevor started screaming. He yelled at Alyssa not to listen to me, calling me a psychotic liar. He grabbed her arm, trying to physically pull her out of the room. Alyssa yanked her arm out of his grasp with violent force. She looked around the trashed room, taking in the sheer desperation radiating from Trevor. She looked back at me, her voice shaking but demanding proof. I did not hesitate. I recited Trevor's real date of birth, his actual social security number, and the names of his childhood pets. I told her that if she wanted undeniable physical proof, she just needed to ask him to roll up his left sleeve. I described the tiny crescent-shaped scar on his forearm, a mark he got from a bicycle accident when he was 12 years old. Alyssa turned to Trevor. Her eyes were hard and shining with angry tears. She ordered him to roll up his sleeve. Trevor clamped his right hand over his left wrist. He refused, shaking his head and begging her to just walk away with him. He said they could leave the resort right now and start over. Alyssa did not say another word. She pulled her arm back and slapped him across the face with everything she had. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. Trevor stumbled backward, clutching his cheek. Alyssa turned on her heel and ran down the corridor, her sobs echoing against the wallpaper. Trevor watched his billionaire safety net evaporate into thin air. He let out a raw, guttural scream of pure rage. He turned his furious eyes on me, his hands curling into tight fists. He lunged across the room, grabbing me by the shoulders and slamming my back against the wall. He spit in my face, screaming that I had just destroyed his entire life. Before he could raise his fist again, the hallway filled with the sound of heavy boots. The resort security team burst through the open door. I had quietly texted the front desk emergency line the moment I heard Trevor kick my door in earlier. 4 muscular guards tackled Trevor to the floor, instantly pinning his arms behind his back. I straightened my linen dress, rubbing my bruised shoulders. I looked down at the man thrashing on the carpet and calmly instructed the guards to remove the trespasser from my room. Trevor was dragged out into the hallway, kicking and screaming vile threats that faded as they hauled him toward the service elevators. I took a deep, shuddering breath. The immediate threat was gone, but the war was far from over. I needed to get my son. I stepped over the wreckage of my luggage and walked briskly down the corridor toward the secure childcare suite where I had left Leo. But as I rounded the corner toward the main atrium, a wall of pure hostility blocked my path. Beatrice, Cameron, and Simone were marching down the hall, shoulder to shoulder. Cameron looked like he was about to suffer a massive cardiac arrest. His phone was glued to his ear, his face a bright, alarming shade of purple. He ended the call and screamed at me, his voice echoing off the marble walls. He yelled that Warren Bradley just pulled out of the entire merger. The deal was completely dead. Alyssa had called her father, and the billionaire investor had severed all ties, freezing Cameron out of the real estate market entirely. Their financial lifeline was officially gone. Beatrice was hyperventilating with rage. Her perfectly coiffed hair was practically vibrating. She pointed a trembling finger at my chest, screeching that I had ruined their family and now they were going to systematically destroy my entire life. Simone stepped forward. The cutthroat corporate lawyer looked completely unhinged, but her eyes were pure, calculating ice. She did not yell. She operated with the lethal precision of a striking snake. Simone held up a thick manila folder stamped with the official seal of a state court. She told me she had just spent the last hour on the phone with a highly compensated judge back in our home state. She explained that she had filed an emergency ex parte order, leveraging her legal connections to bypass standard procedures. She smiled her terrifying, predatory smile. She stated that she had used my trashed hotel room, my screaming in the lobby, and my supposed harassment of resort guests as undeniable proof of a severe psychological breakdown. Simone slapped the folder against my chest. She announced that the document was a binding court order, stripping me of my parental rights effective immediately. She leaned in close, her voice a victorious, chilling whisper. She told me hotel security had already escorted Leo to Beatrice's penthouse, and if I tried to go near him, I would be arrested for kidnapping. The harsh reality of the legal document in my hands was suffocating. Simone stood before me, in her immaculate crimson suit, her dark eyes flashing with the thrill of the kill. She had weaponized the legal system against me with breathtaking speed. The ex parte order was signed by a judge back in our home state, a man who clearly owed Simone or Cameron a massive favor. It granted Beatrice immediate temporary physical custody of my son, citing my supposed mental instability and violent outbursts. Simone tapped her manicured fingernail against the thick paper. She told me the local police had already been notified. She said if I made a single move to resist, I would be thrown into a Mexican jail cell for child endangerment, and she would personally ensure I never crossed the border back home. Behind Simone, the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Two massive resort security guards stepped out, their expressions grim and professional. Right between them stood Beatrice. My mother-in-law looked absolutely triumphant. The panic she had shown in the powder room was entirely gone, replaced by the arrogant certainty of a woman who believed her wealth made her a god. Beatrice pointed down the hall toward the childcare suite. She ordered the guards to accompany her to collect her grandson, loudly stating that his mother was having a severe psychological episode and needed to be kept away for the safety of the child. My heart slammed against my ribs like a caged bird. Every maternal instinct I possessed screamed at me to fight, to throw myself at them, to tear Simone and Beatrice apart with my bare hands. But I am a chief executive officer. I know that losing control in a hostage negotiation is how you lose the hostage. If I screamed or fought, I would hand Simone the exact proof of instability she needed to make this temporary order permanent. I forced my muscles to relax. I took a slow, deep breath, burying my terror beneath layers of cold, calculating ice. I told the guards to wait right there. I said I would bring my son out myself so he would not be frightened by strangers. Simone opened her mouth to object, but I walked past her, my shoulder brushing against her crimson jacket. I moved down the corridor to the glass doors of the childcare suite. I found Leo sitting at a small table, happily coloring a picture of a sea turtle. When he saw me, his face lit up, but his smile faltered as he noticed the tension radiating from my posture. I knelt down on the brightly colored carpet so we were eye to eye. I placed my hands gently on his small shoulders. I kept my voice incredibly soft and steady, betraying none of the absolute war raging inside my chest. I told Leo that we were going to play a very important spy game. I explained that his grandmother had a special mission for him up in the big penthouse, and he needed to act like a brave, undercover agent. Leo's lower lip quivered. He looked past my shoulder, seeing the large security guards waiting in the hall. He clutched my arms, his voice tiny and tight with fear. He asked if I was coming with him. I swallowed the massive, jagged lump of grief in my throat. I looked directly into his beautiful brown eyes and promised him on my life that I would see him by dinner. I told him he just had to be brave for a few hours. I kissed his forehead, breathing in the scent of his shampoo, memorizing the warmth of his skin. I stood up, took his small hand in mine, and led him out into the hallway. I handed his small backpack to Beatrice. She snatched it with a victorious smirk, immediately pulling Leo to her side. Leo looked back at me, tears spilling hot and fast down his cheeks. Simone offered me a chilling, victorious smile. She told me to go back to my ruined room and pack my cheap bags. She said the family was done playing games with me. I stood completely motionless as Beatrice, Simone, and the guards escorted my weeping son onto the elevator. I maintained absolute unwavering eye contact with Simone until the silver doors slid firmly shut. The moment the doors closed, the hallway fell dead silent. A lesser woman would have collapsed onto the floral carpet. A lesser woman would have broken down into hysterical, paralyzing sobs. But I did not shed a single tear. The fragile, grieving widow they thought they were bullying was dead. The mother bear was fully awake and she was out for blood. I turned on my heel and marched straight past my destroyed hotel room. I took the stairs down to the lobby level and walked directly into the resort's private executive business center. I locked the heavy glass door behind me, pulled down the privacy blinds, and sat at a high-end desktop terminal. I pulled out my phone and initiated a highly secure encrypted video link to my lead corporate attorney in New York. Miles answered immediately. He was sitting in his glass-walled office overlooking Manhattan. He took one look at my face and the casual greeting died in his throat. He sat up completely straight, grabbing a pen. He knew exactly what that look meant. It meant total, unmitigated warfare. I did not waste time on pleasantries. I told Miles that Simone had weaponized a corrupt judge to take physical custody of my son. I told him the gloves were off. I did not just want emergency custody motions filed. I wanted the complete systematic obliteration of Cameron's real estate empire and Beatrice's family trust. I ordered Miles to deploy every forensic accountant we had on retainer. I wanted to know exactly who held the debt on Cameron's commercial properties. I wanted to know what banks held the mortgages for Beatrice's assets. I wanted to find the structural weakness in their financial fortress. Miles nodded sharply. He told me to give him 20 minutes and put me on a secure hold. I sat in the quiet business center, staring at the flashing digital clock on the monitor. Every passing minute without my son felt like physical agony. But I channeled every ounce of that pain into pure, calculated focus. I was going to strip them of everything that gave them power. Exactly 18 minutes later, Miles came back onto the screen. He looked like a man who had just struck absolute gold. A rare, dangerous smile spread across his face. He told me he had found the kill shot. Miles explained that Beatrice and Cameron had made a massive, fatal miscalculation. 4 years ago, when Trevor faked his death, they used the $10 million fraudulent life insurance payout as primary collateral to secure a massive line of credit from a private equity group. That specific line of credit funded Cameron's failing real estate firm. Even better, that same line of credit held the master mortgage on the very resort property I was currently standing in. Miles leaned closer to the camera. He explained the domino effect. Because the entire family trust was leveraged against an insurance policy obtained through federal fraud, the collateral was inherently toxic. If the primary lender discovered the fraud, it would trigger a mandatory immediate default cascade. The bank would call the loans, instantly plunging the entire family into catastrophic bankruptcy overnight. But Miles had found something even better than just reporting them to the bank. He told me the private equity group holding their debt was currently liquidating assets to cover their own quarterly losses. They were quietly shopping Cameron's debt portfolio around to private buyers. I felt a cold, ruthless smile curve my lips. I looked at Miles and gave the final devastating order. I told him to use the capital from our recent $80 million tech buyout. I told him to buy their debt right now. I realized with a surge of absolute power that by dinner time, I was not just going to get my son back. I was going to legally own the very ground my enemies were standing on. I was going to foreclose on their entire existence. I disconnected the call, stood up from the leather desk chair, and walked out of the business center. It was time to pay Beatrice a visit in her penthouse. It was time to show them what happens when you try to steal a child from a CEO. The walk from the executive business center to the private penthouse elevator felt like marching to an execution. I swiped the temporary VIP access card Miles had digitally cloned to my phone, granting me access to the highest floor of the resort. The glass elevator shot upward, the breathtaking view of the Cabo coastline expanding beneath me. I did not care about the view. I only cared about the child trapped at the top of the tower. The elevator chimed open, revealing a private foyer lined with imported marble and modern art. I did not bother knocking. I pushed open the double doors of the penthouse suite and stepped inside. The sheer opulence of the room was staggering, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. Beatrice was sitting on a white leather sofa, sipping sparkling water, trying to look unbothered. Cameron was pacing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, checking his phone obsessively. Simone was sitting at a glass dining table, arranging a stack of legal documents with terrifying precision. Trevor was nowhere to be seen. He was likely hiding in a different room, too much of a coward to face the fallout of his ruined billionaire marriage scheme. Simone looked up as I entered. She did not look surprised. She looked like a spider waiting for a mouse to finally walk into her web. She tapped the stack of papers on the table. She told me to come sit down. She said she knew I would come crawling up here once the reality of my situation set in. She boasted that my little stunt at the charity gala was a cute party trick, but this was the major leagues. She pointed to a chair across from her, ordering me to take a seat so we could discuss the terms of my total surrender. I walked slowly across the room, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I pulled out the chair and sat down, keeping my posture perfectly relaxed. I folded my hands on the glass table and looked at Simone. I told her I was listening. Beatrice let out a harsh, victorious laugh from the sofa. She told Cameron that she always knew I was a weak, easily manipulated girl who would fold the second things got difficult. Cameron stopped pacing and smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. They truly believed they had me trapped in a corner. Simone slid a thick bound contract across the table. She slid a heavy gold fountain pen right next to it. She explained the terms with ruthless efficiency. She demanded I sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement covering everything regarding Trevor, the life insurance policy, and the family trust. She demanded I hand over the master files of my cloud recordings, assuming I had the power to scrub them from the federal database. In exchange for my absolute silence and my total compliance, she would graciously tear up the temporary custody order and allow me to leave the resort with Leo. She leaned across the table, her dark eyes locking onto mine. She told me to sign the paper. Take my bastard child and go back to my miserable, pathetic life before she changed her mind and had me committed. I looked down at the contract. I looked at the gold pen. I picked up the pen. I let out a long, defeated sigh, acting exactly like the broken, terrified mother they expected me to be. I uncapped the pen and hovered it over the signature line on the final page. I heard Beatrice utter a sound of supreme satisfaction. I heard Cameron chuckle. I brought the pen down to the paper. But I did not sign my name. I did not write Paige Sterling. In bold, clear, unmistakable letters across the bottom of their legal threat, I wrote 3 simple words. Check your email. I dropped the pen on top of the contract and slid it back across the glass table to Simone. Simone frowned, her perfect brow furrowing in confusion. She looked down at the signature line. She read the words. Her eyes snapped up to glare at me, opening her mouth to demand what kind of stupid joke I was playing. Before she could get a single syllable out, her phone chimed loudly on the table. A fraction of a second later, Cameron's phone buzzed in his pocket. Then Beatrice's phone rang from the sofa. Simone snatched up her phone, swiping open the screen. It was an urgent priority, one notification from the Securities and Exchange Commission, forwarded directly by her senior law partners in the States. I sat back in my chair and watched the blood completely drain from Simone's face. The cutthroat, arrogant corporate lawyer turned the color of chalk. Her jaw went slack. Her hand began to tremble so violently, she nearly dropped the device. Cameron pulled his phone out of his pocket and read the exact same alert. He let out a strangled, breathless gasp, stumbling backward until his spine hit the glass window. I smiled. It was the smile of a CEO who just executed a flawless, fatal corporate strike. I stood up from the table. I told them my holding company had just finalized the purchase of their primary lender's distressed debt portfolio. I explained in slow, crystal-clear terms that I had just bought the commercial debt of Cameron's real estate firm for pennies on the dollar because his company was legally toxic. I took a step toward Cameron, my voice ringing through the silent penthouse. I told him I now owned the cars he drove, the house he slept in, and the master mortgage on this very resort. I turned to Simone, pointing at the shattered expression on her face. I told her that the federal fraud investigation triggered by the insurance payout meant I could call all their loans into immediate catastrophic default right this second. I was no longer their charity case. I was legally their biggest creditor, and I owned their entire existence. Cameron snapped. The realization that a woman he despised had just bought his entire life sent him into a blind, reckless rage. He screamed a vile curse and lunged across the room, raising his fist to strike me. He did not make it past the coffee table. The double doors of the penthouse burst open. 2 massive men in dark suits stepped inside, instantly intercepting Cameron. One guard grabbed Cameron's raised arm, twisted it sharply behind his back, and slammed him face first into the marble wall. These were not resort security. This was the elite private security detail I had hired out of Mexico City hours ago, paid for with the same corporate wealth my family tried to mock. The room descended into absolute terrified chaos. Beatrice began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest. Simone was frantically tapping her phone screen, desperately trying to call her banking contacts to verify the nightmare. I ignored them all. I stepped up to Beatrice, my voice a lethal, commanding bark. I demanded she bring me my son immediately. I told her if I did not have Leo in my arms in 60 seconds, I would foreclose on her life before the sun went down. Beatrice looked up at me, tears of genuine panic streaming down her face. She shook her head, her voice a pathetic, trembling whine. She told me Leo was not in the penthouse. She sobbed, pointing a shaking finger toward the balcony. She said Trevor took him. She claimed Trevor found out about the federal agents, completely panicked, and grabbed Leo as collateral to escape. My blood turned to liquid nitrogen. The corporate victory evaporated in a fraction of a second, replaced by pure, blinding maternal terror. Trevor had kidnapped my son. I spun around, ignoring the weeping woman on the sofa. I pulled out my phone and activated the tracking application I had used religiously since becoming a single mother. 3 years ago, I had sewn a microscopic waterproof GPS tracking chip into the lining of Leo's favorite denim jacket. It was a paranoid habit that was about to save my child's life. A pulsing red dot appeared on the digital map. It was moving rapidly away from the resort property, heading directly south toward the private marina at the edge of the peninsula. Trevor was trying to charter a boat. He was trying to take my son into international waters. I looked at my security team, my voice sharp as broken glass. I told them we were going to the docks. I told them we were hunting a ghost. We sprinted out of the penthouse, leaving the ruined, bankrupt remnants of my in-laws crying on the floor. I did not look back. I was going to rip Trevor apart with my bare hands if he harmed a single hair on my son's head. The clock was ticking, and I was bringing the entire weight of my empire down on the marina. The tires of the armored SUV screeched violently as my private security detail whipped into the loading zone of the Cabo San Lucas private marina. The smell of diesel fuel and salt water flooded my senses as I threw the heavy door open before the vehicle even came to a complete stop. The marina was a labyrinth of multi-million-dollar yachts and luxury catamarans, bobbing against wooden slips in the fading evening light. I pulled out my phone, my eyes locked on the pulsing red dot. It was stationary, located at the far end of Pier C near the transient charter slips. I broke into a dead sprint. My breath burned in my lungs as my heels pounded against the wooden planks of the dock. My 2 security guards flanked me, their hands resting near their waistbands, their eyes scanning the rows of boats for any sudden movement. As I rounded the corner of the final pier, I saw them. Trevor was frantically arguing with a sunburned boat captain near the stern of a weathered twin-engine motor yacht. His hair was wild, his linen shirt soaked with panicked sweat. With his left hand, he was gripping the collar of Leo's denim jacket, practically dragging my son toward the boarding ramp. Leo was crying hysterically, his small hands desperately trying to pry his father's fingers off his jacket. He was screaming for me. The sound of my son's terrified voice ignited a primal, violent rage inside my chest. I did not slow down. I did not call out a warning. I marched straight down the wooden pier, my voice cracking like a whip over the sound of the idling boat engines. I screamed Trevor's name with enough force to stop a moving train. Trevor whipped his head around. His eyes widened in absolute shock as he saw me advancing with 2 massive security guards. He yanked Leo behind his legs, using our 7-year-old son as a human shield. The boat captain took one look at my security detail, threw his hands up in surrender, and immediately backed away from the vessel. Trevor was trapped at the end of the dock. There was nowhere left to run. He pulled a sleek black handgun from his waistband and aimed it directly at my chest. He was shaking so badly the barrel bobbed erratically in the humid air. He screamed at my guards to stay back. He yelled that he had nothing left to lose. He glared at me, his face twisted in a mask of desperate, pathetic entitlement. He demanded a wire transfer. He ordered me to open my banking app and transfer $5 million to a crypto wallet right this second. Or he was getting on the boat and taking Leo to international waters where no custody order or federal agent could ever reach them. My security guards tensed, ready to draw their weapons, but I held up my hand, ordering them to stand down. I did not want a shootout with my son caught in the crossfire. I looked at the gun pointed at my heart. I looked at my sobbing child cowering behind the monster who fathered him. I felt absolutely no fear. Trevor was a coward. He was a man who faked his own death because he was too weak to face a financial audit. He did not have the nerve to pull the trigger. I reached into my pocket. I did not pull out my wallet. I pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen, but I did not open a banking application. I opened a live video feed. I turned the screen around so Trevor could see exactly what I was looking at. I told Trevor to look very closely at the video. I explained that it was a secure real-time feed connected directly to the FBI Financial Crimes Task Force in Miami. The very same task force that had been hunting the missing $10 million for 4 years. The same task force I had sent his recorded confession to hours ago. I watched Trevor's eyes drop to the screen. He saw the official government seal watermark in the corner of the live feed. He heard the static crackle of an agent's voice acknowledging the visual confirmation of a suspect matching his description. I kept walking forward, slow and relentless, staring down the barrel of his shaking gun. I told him he was out of time. I said federal agents had already contacted the Mexican federal police. I pointed toward the entrance of the marina where the distinct wail of police sirens was suddenly cutting through the coastal air, growing louder by the second. Trevor's arrogant facade completely collapsed. The reality of a federal prison sentence finally caught up to him. His hand began to lower. The gun pointed toward the wooden dock. He looked wildly at the flashing red and blue lights speeding toward the marina gates. He dropped the weapon. It clattered harmlessly against the wooden planks. Trevor let go of Leo's jacket, falling to his knees on the dock. He threw his hands over his face and began to sob, muttering pathetic apologies, begging me to tell the agents he was forced to do it. He looked up at me, his face stained with tears, and called me his beloved wife, begging for mercy. I did not even look at him. I stepped past his kneeling form, scooped my sobbing son into my arms, and buried my face in his neck. I held Leo so tightly, my arms ached, whispering that he was safe, that the game was over, and that Mommy had him. I looked down at the pathetic weeping man on the dock as Mexican authorities sprinted down the pier, weapons drawn, barking orders. I looked Trevor dead in the eyes, my voice dripping with absolute zero emotion. I told him my husband died 4 years ago. I said he was just a ghost, and ghosts belong in the dark. I turned my back on him as the police tackled him to the wooden planks, slapping heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. I carried my son away from the water, shielding his eyes from the pathetic arrest of a man who was never a father. I loaded Leo into the back of my secure SUV, wrapping him in a warm blanket and handing him an iPad to watch his favorite movie. My security team climbed into the front seats, ready to drive us to our new 5-star sanctuary across the bay. But as the engine rumbled to life, I looked back toward the resort towering over the coastline in the distance. The federal agents had Trevor. My son was safe, but I was not finished. There was a conference room back at that resort holding 3 people who tried to destroy my sanity, steal my child, and strip me of my dignity. Beatrice, Cameron, and Simone were about to learn exactly what happens when you hand a CEO the keys to your financial execution. I told my driver to head back to the resort. It was time for a final family board meeting. The heavy oak doors of the resort's private executive conference room swung open with a forceful crack. My 2 security guards stepped in first, physically securing the exits and locking the doors from the inside with an audible metallic click. The room was in a state of absolute frantic chaos. Beatrice, Cameron, and Simone were clustered around a massive mahogany table, surrounded by open laptops and scattered financial documents. They were desperately trying to wire funds, shred physical papers, and salvage whatever scraps of their empire they could before the authorities arrived. When the lock clicked, all 3 of them froze. They slowly turned to face me. The sheer panic in their eyes was the most satisfying visual of my entire life. I walked into the room, my emerald silk gown swishing softly against the carpet. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush. I walked directly to the head of the conference table, the seat of ultimate authority, and pulled out the high-backed leather chair. I sat down, folded my hands on the polished wood, and looked at the ruins of the family that had tried to bury me alive. I told them the board meeting was officially called to order. Cameron was the first to break. He slammed his laptop shut, his face twisted in a mixture of terror and rage. He demanded to know where Trevor was and what I had done with his brother. I smiled warmly. I informed him that his brother was currently in the custody of the Mexican Federal Police, awaiting expedited extradition back to the United States to face a mountain of federal insurance fraud charges. I added that Trevor had sung like a canary on the docks, officially naming Cameron, Beatrice, and Simone as his co-conspirators in exchange for a lighter sentence. Beatrice let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She clutched her pearl necklace, swaying on her feet as if the gravity in the room had suddenly doubled. She looked at Simone, begging her daughter-in-law to do something, demanding that she use her legal connections to fix this nightmare. Simone did not move. The ruthless corporate lawyer was staring at her laptop screen, her dark eyes wide and unblinking. She was reading the digital death warrant I had just emailed to her professional inbox. I leaned forward, addressing Simone directly. I asked her if she liked the draft of the disbarment papers my legal team had prepared for her. I explained that facilitating a $10 million insurance fraud, forging medical documents, and attempting to extort a CEO using a corrupt judge were fast tracks to losing her license to practice law permanently. I told her the State Bar Association had already received the audio recordings of her stairwell confession. Simone's flawless composure shattered entirely. The survival instinct of a cornered predator took over. She instantly turned on her own family. Simone pointed a shaking finger at Beatrice. Her voice cracked as she screamed that she was forced into the scheme. She claimed Beatrice had threatened to ruin her career years ago if she did not help hide Trevor's money. She yelled that she was just following the matriarch's orders to protect the family trust. Beatrice's face turned purple with outrage. She lunged across the table, slapping Simone violently across the face. The sharp crack echoed through the conference room. Beatrice screamed that Simone was a greedy, manipulative liar who orchestrated the entire life insurance payout just to fund her lavish lifestyle. Cameron tried to pull his mother back, yelling at his wife for turning traitor. The perfect family, the untouchable elite, who had spent 4 years mocking my poverty and questioning my sanity, were now tearing each other apart like rabid dogs, fighting over a scrap of meat. I sat at the head of the table and watched them self-destruct. I let them scream and point fingers for 2 full minutes. It was a masterpiece of poetic justice. When I had seen enough, I reached into my clutch. I pulled out the crisp white wellness agreement Simone had tried to force me to sign earlier that morning, the document that demanded my absolute obedience in exchange for a meager trust fund stipend. I held the document up. The arguing abruptly stopped as their eyes locked onto the paper. Slowly, deliberately, I tore the agreement in half. I tore it again, dropping the shredded pieces onto the polished mahogany table. I reached back into my clutch and pulled out a stack of 3 official, legally binding documents. I slid them across the table. They stopped directly in front of Cameron. I told them those were immediate eviction notices. Since my holding company now legally owned the distressed debt of this very resort, I was officially foreclosing on their complimentary penthouses. I informed them that their bank accounts were federally frozen, their credit cards were flagged for fraud, and they did not have a single dime to their names. I demanded they vacate the resort property immediately. Cameron stared at the eviction notices, his hands trembling. He looked up at me, a pathetic, broken man. He begged for time. He said they had no cash, no way to book flights home, and nowhere to go. He pleaded that they were family, and that I could not just throw them out onto the street in a foreign country. I did not offer a shred of sympathy. I reached into my clutch one final time. I pulled out a single crumpled piece of currency. It was the exact same $100 bill Beatrice had thrown at my chest during breakfast, the one she told me to use to buy my son cheap ice cream so we would not ruin their networking brunch. I flicked the $100 bill across the table. It fluttered and landed right on top of the eviction notices. I looked Beatrice dead in the eyes and repeated her exact words back to her. I told her to take the money and call an Uber. I told her not to worry because she could handle it. She was strong, right? Beatrice stared at the bill, her lips trembling, tears of absolute humiliation spilling over her mascara. Before any of them could grab the money, the heavy oak doors opened again. This time, it was not my private security. A team of local police officers, accompanied by two federal agents who had flown in to coordinate the arrest, stepped into the conference room. They held up a stack of international warrants for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and extortion. The agents ordered Beatrice, Cameron, and Simone to put their hands behind their backs. I stood up from the head of the table, smoothing the silk of my emerald gown. I walked silently past my in-laws as the cold steel handcuffs clicked tightly around their wrists. I stepped out of the conference room and into the brightly lit resort corridor. The air felt incredibly light. The crushing weight of the last 4 years was entirely gone. But as I walked toward the elevators, I heard Simone's voice echoing down the hall. She was not finished fighting. She was desperate, and a desperate lawyer is a dangerous thing. She screamed my name, dragging her handcuffed wrists against the grip of the federal agents. Simone yelled that she had hidden files. She claimed she had dirt on my biotech company proprietary secrets she had hacked from my servers. She threatened to leak them to my biggest competitors the second she got a phone call, vowing to ruin my $80 million empire just like I ruined hers. I stopped walking. I turned around to face the woman being restrained by federal law enforcement. I offered her a calm, almost pitying smile. I explained corporate law to the seasoned Harvard partner. I told her she had just breached attorney-client privilege, engaged in extortion, and loudly admitted to corporate espionage directly in front of federal agents. I smiled wider, informing her that my company's stock value was actually going to skyrocket when the market saw how ruthlessly I dismantled threats to my empire. Simone's mouth snapped shut. The fight completely drained out of her eyes. She finally realized she had lost everything, including her mind. The agents marched Beatrice, Cameron, and Simone down the grand staircase and directly through the main resort lobby. It was the exact same lobby where they had paraded me as a crazy, grieving widow just hours ago. Now they were the spectacle. They were paraded in handcuffs right past the elite investors, socialites, and venture capitalists they had been trying to impress all weekend. Richard Montgomery stood by the lobby bar, watching the family's humiliating exit with profound disgust. I stood on the mezzanine balcony, watching the police cruisers pull away from the resort entrance, their red and blue lights flashing against the palm trees. My phone vibrated in my hand. It was Miles, my lead attorney back in New York. I answered the call, my voice steady and clear. Miles told me the offshore accounts were successfully seized, the real estate debt was fully acquired, and the family trust was officially bankrupted. The financial war was over. I had won. But there was one final, deeply personal piece of business left to conclude before I could truly go home. The national news broke the very next morning. The headlines dominated every major network and financial publication across the country. Dead man found alive in Cabo, wealthy real estate family indicted in massive insurance fraud ring. The media frenzy was absolute chaos, but I did not hide from it. I leaned into it. I gave one exclusive, highly orchestrated interview to a top-tier financial network. I did not sit in a dim room dabbing tears with a tissue playing the role of the traumatized, deceived widow. I sat in a sleek, glass-walled boardroom in Manhattan, wearing a razor-sharp tailored suit. I spoke not as a victim, but as the triumphant CEO who had utilized her own corporate intelligence network to uncover a massive federal fraud ring. I completely controlled the narrative. I painted Trevor and his family as sloppy, desperate criminals who vastly underestimated the wrong woman. My company's stock soared just as I predicted. With the public relations victory secured, I handled the most important legal matter of my life. I marched into a family court judge's office and officially legally changed Leo's last name to my maiden name. With a few strokes of a pen, Trevor was legally erased from my son's birth certificate and our lives forever. A month later, the dust had settled. Trevor, Cameron, and Simone were sitting in federal holding cells awaiting trial, facing decades in prison. Beatrice, due to a plea deal where she flipped on her own children, was serving a lighter sentence in a minimum security federal prison in upstate New York. On a crisp Tuesday morning, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived at my corporate office. It was stamped with the seal of the Federal Correctional Facility. It was a handwritten letter from Beatrice. I opened it with a silver letter opener. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. Beatrice spent 3 pages begging for my forgiveness. She claimed the prison food was making her ill and that she was terrified of the other inmates. She begged me to use my vast resources to set up a legal defense fund for her appeals. She ended the pathetic letter with the exact same manipulative, toxic language she had used to control me for years. Please help me, Paige. We are family. I read the letter once, my expression perfectly blank. I did not throw it away. I did not hand it to my lawyers. I buzzed my executive assistant and told him to clear my afternoon schedule. I was going to visit the prison. I was going to deliver my reply in person. The visitation room at the Federal Correctional Facility was stark, smelling of industrial bleach and stale despair. I sat at a metal table bolted to the linoleum floor. I did not bring a lawyer. I came entirely alone, wearing a bespoke, immaculate white power suit that cost more than Beatrice's entire remaining net worth. A heavy steel door buzzed open. Beatrice was escorted into the room by a guard. The transformation was shocking. The arrogant, diamond-draped matriarch who had ruled country clubs was gone. She was wearing a baggy, faded orange jumpsuit. Her hair was entirely gray, her roots showing inches of neglect. She looked frail, exhausted, and utterly broken. She sat down across from me, her hands trembling as she folded them on the metal table. She looked at my pristine white suit, then up at my face. Tears welled in her eyes. She started to speak, her voice a desperate, rasping whisper, thanking me for coming, and launching into another pathetic plea for financial rescue. I held up one manicured hand, stopping her dead in her tracks. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold metal table. I looked directly into the eyes of the woman who had tried to convince the world I was insane. My voice was calm, steady, and colder than the concrete walls surrounding us. I told Beatrice she never actually saw me. I explained that she only saw a fragile girl she thought she could break, a charity case she could control to feed her own massive ego. I lowered my voice to a lethal whisper. I told her that all the crushing pressure she and her family put on me did not break me. It turned me into an unbreakable diamond. I smiled, leaning back in my chair. I told her that now, while I was running a global empire and raising a brilliant, happy son, she gets to spend the rest of her miserable life staring at concrete walls, knowing she put herself there. Beatrice let out a strangled sob, reaching across the table to grab my hands, begging me not to leave her in this horrible place. I pulled my hands back smoothly. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a single glossy photograph. I slid it face up across the metal table. It was a picture of me and Leo taken just last week. We were standing on the deck of my newly purchased luxury yacht, laughing in the bright sunshine, looking incredibly wealthy, happy, and totally free. I stood up, smoothing the front of my white blazer. I looked down at Beatrice, who was weeping uncontrollably over the photograph. I did not say another word. I turned on my heel and walked out of the visitation room, the heavy steel doors clicking shut behind me, completely cutting off the sound of her desperate screams. I stepped out of the gloomy prison facility and into the bright, blinding sunlight of a beautiful afternoon. The air smelled like freedom. I walked past the razor wire fences toward my waiting armored SUV, where my son was safely buckled into the back seat playing a video game. I climbed into the back, wrapping my arms around Leo and pulling him into a tight, warm hug. He giggled, leaning his head against my shoulder. The driver put the car in gear, but we were not heading home. There was one final destination before this chapter was permanently closed. We drove straight to a private luxury airfield outside the city. Sitting on the sunlit tarmac was a sleek, brand-new Gulfstream jet, its engines humming quietly, waiting for my command. As we walked up the stairs into the plush, custom leather cabin, I took a moment to reflect on the unbelievable journey of the last 4 years. I had survived being the family scapegoat. I had endured the role of the poor, delusional widow. I had suffered their mockery of my medical drawings. I realized as I settled into my plush seat that my true superpower was never my $80 million. My real strength was my ability to endure their incredible darkness without ever letting it corrupt my own soul. I survived their fire and I used it to forge my own crown. Leo buckled his seatbelt, looking out the large oval window at the receding terminal. He turned to me, his big brown eyes full of innocent curiosity. He asked if we were ever going back to see the bad people who made me sad at the resort. I smiled, reaching over to smooth a stray lock of hair from his forehead. I looked at the boy who was the center of my entire universe, the child I had fought a war to protect. I told him no, baby. I said we only fly forward. The private jet accelerated down the runway, lifting smoothly into the vast, limitless blue sky. I leaned back in my seat as a flight attendant handed me a crystal flute of vintage champagne. I took a slow, satisfying sip, looking out at the horizon. The ultimate, sweetest revenge was not just destroying the monsters who tried to ruin me. It was living a spectacular, beautifully untouchable life that they could never ever be a part of. I smiled a genuine, victorious smile as we flew directly into the sunset, leaving the ghosts exactly where they belonged in the past. The silence in the penthouse was absolute, broken only by the faint, rapid buzzing of incoming notifications on their devices. Simone stared at her glowing screen, her dark eyes wide and unblinking. The pristine, legal mind that had orchestrated a massive federal fraud was currently short-circuiting. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a dry, raspy sound came out. She swiped her thumb across the screen again, as if refreshing her inbox would somehow change reality. Cameron was clutching his phone with white knuckles. He looked up from the screen, his chest heaving. He asked Simone what the email meant, his voice cracking with sudden, uncharacteristic panic. He said it was a formal notice of acquisition from a corporate holding entity he did not recognize. Simone finally found her voice. It was a hollow, defeated whisper. She told Cameron that the holding company listed on the legal notice had just assumed total ownership of his commercial real estate portfolio. She looked up at me, her terrifying predator facade completely shattered. She stated that my biotech firm was the parent company of that holding entity. I did not just sit there and gloat. I stood up, pushing the heavy leather chair back. I smoothed the skirt of my dress and walked slowly around the edge of the glass dining table. I told them my lead corporate attorney in New York had been very busy while they were trying to intimidate me. Beatrice clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes darting between her son and her daughter-in-law. She demanded to know what was happening, her voice shrill and demanding. She ordered Cameron to explain why an email was making him look like he was about to have a heart attack. I answered for him. I told Beatrice that her brilliant son had made a catastrophic financial miscalculation. I explained that 4 years ago, when they faked Trevor's death, they used the $10 million fraudulent life insurance payout as primary collateral. They used that dirty money to secure a massive line of credit from a private equity group to save Cameron's failing real estate firm. I walked closer to Cameron, keeping my voice perfectly calm and lethal. I told him that his primary lender was quietly liquidating assets to cover their own quarterly losses. I explained that because his entire family trust was leveraged against an insurance policy obtained through federal fraud, his commercial debt was inherently toxic. The bank wanted to offload it immediately. I stopped right in front of Cameron. I told him I used the capital from my recent $80 million tech buyout to purchase his distressed debt portfolio for pennies on the dollar. I leaned in close, making sure he heard every single syllable. I told him I did not just own his debt. I was now legally his biggest creditor. I owned the luxury cars he drove. I owned the sprawling house he slept in. I owned the master mortgage on this very resort. I turned to Simone, who was still staring blankly at her phone. I told her that the federal fraud investigation triggered by the insurance payout meant I could legally call all their loans into immediate catastrophic default right this second. I informed them that they were entirely bankrupt, and I held the absolute power to foreclose on their entire existence before the sun went down. The reality of the situation finally penetrated Cameron's massive, fragile ego. The realization that a woman he despised, a woman he had treated like a pathetic charity case for 4 years, had just bought his entire life, sent him into a blind, reckless rage. His face turned a deep, violent shade of purple. He screamed a vile curse, dropping his phone onto the floor. Cameron lunged at me across the space. He raised his fists, his eyes wild with the intent to cause severe physical harm. He was a large man, built from years of private tennis clubs and personal trainers, and he threw his entire body weight forward. He did not make it past the edge of the glass table. The heavy double doors of the penthouse suite burst open with a deafening crash. Two massive men dressed in dark tactical suits stepped into the room with terrifying speed. I had hired this elite private security detail out of Mexico City hours ago, paying a premium to have them stationed directly outside the penthouse doors the moment I entered. The first security guard moved with flawless precision. He intercepted Cameron mid-lunge, grabbing his raised arm and twisting it sharply behind his back. The guard used Cameron's own momentum to slam him face first into the marble wall. The impact rattled the framed modern art hanging nearby. The second guard stepped squarely between me and the rest of the room, his hand resting casually near his waistband, his posture radiating a silent, lethal warning. Cameron groaned in pain, his cheek pressed flat against the cold stone, his arm pinned securely behind him. The fight drained out of him instantly, replaced by the humiliating reality of his physical and financial defeat. Simone sat perfectly still at the table, her hands raised slightly in the air, showing she was not a threat. Her sharp legal mind recognized that any physical altercation would just add assault charges to her impending federal indictment. Beatrice let out a high-pitched shriek. She scrambled backward on the white leather sofa, pulling her legs to her chest like a frightened child. The arrogant matriarch who had ruled her social circles through intimidation and wealth was completely unraveled. She looked at the security guards, then at me, tears of genuine panic streaming down her face. I ignored Cameron groaning against the wall. I ignored Simone sitting frozen at the table. I walked directly over to the sofa and stood over Beatrice. My voice was a cold, sharp blade cutting through the chaotic energy of the room. I told Beatrice the corporate games were over. I demanded she bring me my son immediately. I informed her that if I did not have Leo in my arms in exactly 60 seconds, I would order my lawyers to freeze every single bank account associated with her name. I promised her she would not even have enough liquid cash to buy a bottle of water by dinner time. Beatrice looked up at me, her mascara running in dark streaks down her pale cheeks. She shook her head violently, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps. She raised a shaking finger and pointed toward the massive glass balcony doors. She sobbed uncontrollably, her voice a pathetic, trembling whine. She told me Leo was not in the penthouse. My blood turned to liquid nitrogen. The triumphant corporate victory evaporated in a fraction of a second, completely obliterated by a sudden blinding wave of maternal terror. I demanded to know where my son was. Beatrice shrank back against the leather cushions, weeping hysterically. She confessed that Trevor had found out about the federal agents investigating the insurance fraud. She said Trevor had completely panicked, realizing he was about to spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. She choked on her tears, admitting that Trevor had grabbed Leo as collateral to ensure his escape. My dead husband had just kidnapped my son. I stood completely still on the wooden dock, the salty evening breeze whipping my hair around my face. The barrel of Trevor's black handgun was pointed directly at my chest, trembling violently in his panicked grip. He was screaming at me to open my banking application, demanding an immediate $5 million transfer. He threatened to drag our terrified son onto the idling yacht and disappear into international waters where no custody order could ever reach him. My two private security guards tensed their hands, hovering over their concealed weapons, waiting for my signal to strike. I did not give it. A shootout was the absolute last thing I wanted, with my 7-year-old son standing just inches away from the line of fire. I reached into my pocket. Trevor's eyes darted down to my hand, fully expecting to see me pull out my wallet or load a cryptocurrency transfer on my screen. Instead, I pulled out my phone, tapped the screen, and rotated the device. I held it up high so the bright display cut through the fading coastal light. I did not show him a bank transfer. I showed him a secure high-definition video feed. I told Trevor to look very closely at the screen. I kept my voice loud, clear, and utterly devoid of fear. I explained that he was looking at a live encrypted broadcast connected directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Task Force in Miami. I told him it was the exact same task force that had been hunting the missing $10 million life insurance payout for 4 years. The same task force I had sent his recorded hallway confession to hours ago. Trevor squinted at the glowing screen. The blood completely drained from his face as he registered the official government seal watermark in the corner of the video player. He heard the sharp, static crackle of a federal agent's voice, confirming visual identification of the primary suspect. His arrogant, threatening facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The reality of a massive federal indictment crashed down on him with the weight of a collapsing skyscraper. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, ignoring the gun pointed at my heart. I told him he was completely out of time. I explained that the federal agents had immediately contacted the Mexican federal police the second I tracked his location to this marina. I raised my free hand and pointed toward the main entrance of the docks. At that exact moment, the piercing wail of police sirens ripped through the humid evening air. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the rows of luxury yachts speeding rapidly down the main access road and swarming the gated entrance. Trevor's head snapped toward the flashing lights. He looked back at me, his chest heaving with sheer, unadulterated panic. The heavy handgun slipped from his sweaty fingers. It hit the wooden dock with a dull clatter, completely useless. The second the weapon hit the ground, Trevor released his grip on Leo's denim jacket. He took a stumbling step backward toward the water, instinctively looking for a way to run. But there was nowhere to go. My private security guards moved with terrifying speed. They kicked the weapon away into the water and shoved Trevor backward, but the local authorities were already swarming the pier. Heavily armed Mexican police officers sprinted down the wooden planks, barking sharp commands in Spanish. I did not care about the arrest. The moment Trevor let go, I dropped my phone and lunged forward. I dropped to my knees on the rough wood and scooped my sobbing son into my arms. I buried my face in his neck, inhaling the scent of his shampoo mixed with the salty sea air. I held him so tightly my arms ached. I whispered in his ear, promising him that the scary part was over, that he was perfectly safe, and that I had him. I picked him up, turning his face into my shoulder, so he would not have to watch the chaotic, violent scene unfolding right behind us. The police tackled Trevor to the dock. The sound of a physical struggle ended quickly with the sharp, definitive click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists. They hauled him roughly to his feet. His expensive linen shirt was torn and covered in dirt. He was no longer the smug, wealthy investor sipping margaritas by a luxury pool. He was a defeated, cornered criminal. As the officers began to drag him down the pier toward the waiting squad cars, Trevor locked eyes with me. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by pathetic, weeping desperation. He struggled against the officer's grip, turning his tear-stained face toward me. He sobbed my name. He begged me to tell the authorities it was a mistake. He pleaded with me to hire a lawyer for him, calling me his beloved wife, crying that we could still be a family. I stood tall, shifting Leo's weight on my hip, ensuring my son's eyes remained shielded. I looked at the pathetic, weeping man who had faked his own death, abandoned his family, and tried to use our child as a bargaining chip. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No anger, no sorrow, no lingering attachment. My voice was a block of solid ice. I told him my husband died 4 years ago. I said he was just a ghost, and ghosts belong in the dark. I turned my back on him. I did not look over my shoulder as his desperate, sobbing pleas were cut off by the slamming doors of a police cruiser. I marched straight down the pier, flanked by my massive security detail. We reached the armored sport utility vehicle, waiting at the loading zone. I gently buckled Leo into the back seat, wrapping him in a warm plush blanket and handing him a tablet loaded with his favorite animated movies. I climbed into the back seat next to him, gently stroking his hair until his frantic crying subsided into exhausted hiccups. The driver put the heavy vehicle into gear, checking the rearview mirror for my instructions. He asked if we were heading to the secure 5-star property I had booked across the bay to get some rest. I looked out the tinted window. The flashing police lights were fading in the distance, but the war was not completely over. I looked at the towering silhouette of the luxury resort looming against the night sky miles away. The federal agents had Trevor, and my son was finally safe. But I was not finished. There was a private penthouse conference room back at that resort holding 3 people who had spent 4 years mocking my grief, trying to steal my child, and attempting to strip me of my dignity. Beatrice, Cameron, and Simone were about to learn exactly what happens when you hand a chief executive officer the keys to your financial execution. I leaned forward and told my driver to turn the vehicle around and head back to the resort. It was time for a final family board meeting. The heavy oak doors of the resort's private executive conference room swung open with a forceful crack. My 2 security guards stepped in first, physically securing the exits and locking the doors from the inside with an audible metallic click. The room was in a state of absolute frantic chaos. Beatrice, Cameron, and Simone were clustered around a massive mahogany table, surrounded by open laptops and scattered financial documents. They were desperately trying to wire funds, shred physical papers, and salvage whatever scraps of their empire they could before the authorities arrived. When the lock clicked, all 3 of them froze. They slowly turned to face me. The sheer panic in their eyes was the most satisfying visual of my entire life. I walked into the room, my emerald silk gown swishing softly against the carpet. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush. I walked directly to the head of the conference table, the seat of ultimate authority, and pulled out the high-backed leather chair. I sat down, folded my hands on the polished wood, and looked at the ruins of the family that had tried to bury me alive. I told them the board meeting was officially called to order. Cameron was the first to break. He slammed his laptop shut, his face twisted in a mixture of terror and rage. He demanded to know where Trevor was and what I had done with his brother. I smiled warmly. I informed him that his brother was currently in the custody of the Mexican Federal Police, awaiting expedited extradition back to the United States to face a mountain of federal insurance fraud charges. I added that Trevor had sung like a canary on the docks, officially naming Cameron, Beatrice, and Simone as his co-conspirators in exchange for a lighter sentence. Beatrice let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She clutched her pearl necklace, swaying on her feet as if the gravity in the room had suddenly doubled. She looked at Simone, begging her daughter-in-law to do something, demanding that she use her legal connections to fix this nightmare. Simone did not move. The ruthless corporate lawyer was staring at her laptop screen, her dark eyes wide and unblinking. She was reading the digital death warrant I had just emailed to her professional inbox. I leaned forward, addressing Simone directly. I asked her if she liked the draft of the disbarment papers my legal team had prepared for her. I explained that facilitating a $10 million insurance fraud, forging medical documents, and attempting to extort a CEO using a corrupt judge were fast tracks to losing her license to practice law permanently. I told her the State Bar Association had already received the audio recordings of her stairwell confession. Simone's flawless composure shattered entirely. The survival instinct of a cornered predator took over. She instantly turned on her own family. Simone pointed a shaking finger at Beatrice. Her voice cracked as she screamed that she was forced into the scheme. She claimed Beatrice had threatened to ruin her career years ago if she did not help hide Trevor's money. She yelled that she was just following the matriarch's orders to protect the family trust. Beatrice's face turned purple with outrage. She lunged across the table, slapping Simone violently across the face. The sharp crack echoed through the conference room. Beatrice screamed that Simone was a greedy, manipulative liar who orchestrated the entire life insurance payout just to fund her lavish lifestyle. Cameron tried to pull his mother back, yelling at his wife for turning traitor. The perfect family, the untouchable elite who had spent 4 years mocking my poverty and questioning my sanity, were now tearing each other apart like rabid dogs fighting over a scrap of meat. I sat at the head of the table and watched them self-destruct. I let them scream and point fingers for 2 full minutes. It was a masterpiece of poetic justice. The echoes of the sharp slap and the furious shrieking bounced off the mahogany walls of the resort conference room. I sat back in the heavy leather executive chair at the head of the table, perfectly still, letting their vicious civil war run its course. For 4 years, they had presented a united front of flawless aristocratic perfection. Now, stripped of their stolen wealth and facing federal prison, the facade had completely rotted away. They were vicious, desperate, and entirely pathetic. I gave them exactly 2 minutes, of pure, uninterrupted self-destruction. When their screaming match dissolved into exhausted, terrified panting, I leaned forward and rested my hands on the cool glass surface of the table. The sudden movement drew their panicked eyes back to me. The room fell dead silent. I reached into my designer clutch. My fingers brushed past my phone and closed around a thick, folded stack of high-quality legal paper. I pulled it out and tossed it casually onto the center of the table. It was the wellness agreement. The very same binding document Simone had shoved in my face on my first day at this resort. The contract designed to force my total obedience, threatening to cut off my meager trust fund stipend if I did not play the part of the fragile, dependent widow. Simone stared at the document, her chest heaving, a red mark blooming fiercely across her cheek, where her mother-in-law had just struck her. I picked up the wellness agreement. I gripped the edges firmly and ripped the thick stack of paper squarely in half. The tearing sound was loud and crisp in the quiet room. I placed the shredded halves neatly on the table. I reached back into my clutch and pulled out a new stack of documents. These were printed on stark white paper bearing the official seal of the local property authority, expedited by my highly paid legal team back in the States. I slid them across the polished wood. They came to a stop directly in front of Cameron. I kept my voice dangerously level. I informed them those were immediate, non-negotiable eviction notices. I reminded them that my holding company now legally owned the distressed debt portfolio of this entire luxury resort. Because they were currently occupying the premium penthouses on a complimentary basis provided by their now toxic defaulted corporate account, I was officially foreclosing on their stay. I was the landlord, and they were trespassing on my property. I told them they had exactly 15 minutes to vacate the premises. Cameron stared at the eviction notices as if they were covered in venom. The last shreds of his golden boy arrogance evaporated. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and pleading. The man who had mocked my career, the man who had tried to physically intimidate me just hours ago, was now openly begging. He stammered that 15 minutes was impossible. He frantically explained that all their corporate and personal credit cards were completely frozen. He said they could not book a flight back to the United States. He pleaded that they did not even have enough liquid cash to pay for a taxi to the airport. He begged me to show some mercy, claiming they were stranded in a foreign country with absolutely nothing to their names. Beatrice began to weep again, a loud, ugly sound. She clutched her pearl necklace, looking at me with desperate, terrified eyes. She whined that they were family and that I could not just throw them out onto the street like common criminals. I did not blink. I did not offer a single ounce of pity. I had reserved all my mercy for my son. I reached into my clutch one final time. My fingers found exactly what I was looking for. I pulled out a single crumpled piece of American currency. It was the crisp $100 bill Beatrice had thrown at my chest on the dining terrace during breakfast. The same bill she had ordered me to take so I could buy my son cheap ice cream and stay out of sight while they entertained their wealthy investors. I held the bill up so the overhead chandelier light caught the green ink. Beatrice stopped crying for a fraction of a second, her eyes locking onto the money. She recognized it instantly. I did not hand it to her. I opened my fingers and let the $100 bill flutter down to the floor. It landed softly on the expensive carpet right near the toe of Beatrice's designer shoe. I looked directly into her tear-streaked face and repeated her exact words back to her, matching the cruel, condescending tone she had used on me. I told her to take an Uber. I told her not to worry because she could handle it. I tilted my head and asked her if she was strong, right? Beatrice let out a strangled, pathetic gasp. She slumped forward, completely broken by the absolute crushing humiliation of the moment. Cameron buried his face in his hands, defeated. Simone just stared at the wall, her brilliant legal mind entirely unable to process the magnitude of her total destruction. I stood up from the heavy leather chair. I smoothed the front of my emerald green silk gown. I informed them their 15 minutes had officially started, and I expected them off my property immediately. They scrambled. The wealthy, untouchable elite were suddenly moving like panicked refugees. Cameron blindly grabbed at the useless frozen credit cards scattered on the table. Simone shoved her disabled laptop into her leather briefcase, her hands shaking violently. Beatrice actually dropped to her knees on the carpet, her trembling fingers reaching out to pick up the crumpled $100 bill I had dropped. It was a pathetic, chaotic display of a dynasty reduced to absolute rubble. But before they could even reach the heavy oak doors to flee the conference room, the doors were forcefully pushed open from the outside. My private security guards stepped aside. A team of local police officers marched into the room, their expressions stern and uncompromising. Walking right behind them were two plainclothes federal agents who had flown in directly from the United States to coordinate the high-profile arrest. The lead federal agent held up a thick stack of international warrants. His voice boomed over the frantic scrambling of my in-laws. He announced that Cameron, Beatrice, and Simone were all under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal insurance fraud, international money laundering, and extortion. Beatrice dropped the $100 bill. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream as a local officer grabbed her arms and pulled them roughly behind her back. The sharp, definitive click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around her wrists echoed through the room. Cameron did not fight. He simply went limp, allowing the officers to cuff him, his face buried against his chest in total surrender. Simone tried to invoke her legal rights, shouting frantic legal jargon at the federal agents, but they completely ignored her, locking the steel cuffs around her wrists with practiced efficiency. I stood quietly at the head of the mahogany table, watching the authorities secure the three people who had tried to ruin my life. Simone dug the heels of her expensive pumps deep into the plush carpet of the conference room. She violently twisted her shoulders against the firm grip of the two federal agents. The flawless, collected corporate lawyer was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. She screamed my name, the sound raw and echoing off the polished mahogany walls. She yelled that I was making a massive, catastrophic mistake. She claimed she had spent the last 2 days deploying shadow software into my company network. She shrieked that she had successfully bypassed my encrypted cloud servers and downloaded highly sensitive proprietary files, raw source code, and unreleased medical visualization algorithms. She looked at me with wild, bloodshot eyes and threatened to leak every single terabyte of data to my biggest global competitors the absolute second she was granted a phone call. She promised to burn my $80 million empire to the ground right alongside hers. I did not flinch. I did not rush forward in a panic to stop her from talking. I simply stood at the head of the massive conference table, smoothing the emerald silk of my custom gown. I offered her a calm, almost pitying smile. I walked slowly around the edge of the table until I was standing just a few feet away from the woman who had confidently threatened to steal my son in a concrete stairwell. I looked directly into her panicked, furious eyes. I took a breath and calmly explained basic corporate law to the seasoned Harvard partner. I kept my voice perfectly level so the federal agents restraining her could hear every single syllable clearly. I told Simone she had just publicly admitted to breaching attorney-client privilege, engaging in active extortion, and committing blatant corporate espionage. I pointed out that she had confessed to multiple federal felonies directly in front of a room full of sworn law enforcement officers who were actively processing her arrest. I let that heavy, undeniable reality sink in for a long, agonizing second. Then my smile grew a fraction wider. I told her that my company stock was not going to crash. I informed her that the market value was actually going to skyrocket the moment Wall Street investors saw how ruthlessly and efficiently I dismantled threats to my business. Simone's mouth snapped shut with an audible click. The frantic fighting energy completely drained out of her body, leaving her looking hollow and utterly defeated. She finally realized she had lost absolutely everything, including her brilliant legal mind. She stopped struggling against the federal agents and let her head drop forward in total surrender. The lead federal agent gave a sharp nod to his team. The officers began to march Beatrice, Cameron, and Simone out of the private conference room. I stepped out into the brightly lit resort corridor and followed them at a comfortable distance. I was absolutely not going to miss the grand finale of their 4-year performance. The authorities led the handcuffed trio out of the private executive wing and directed them toward the grand marble staircase. The staircase descended straight into the main resort lobby. It was the exact same sprawling, luxurious lobby where they had paraded me as a crazy, hallucinating, grieving widow just hours ago. Now the roles were completely reversed. They were the spectacle. The evening networking events were in full swing. The lobby and adjoining cocktail bar were packed with the elite investors, high society socialites, and venture capitalists Cameron had been desperately courting all weekend. The soft classical music and polite chatter died instantly as the police procession came into view. I stood on the mezzanine balcony looking down at the absolute destruction of their social standing. Beatrice tried to hide her tear-stained face behind her shoulder, weeping loudly and shaking uncontrollably as she was marched past her wealthy peers. The women she had sipped champagne with that very morning now stared at her with open, unapologetic shock. Cameron kept his chin tucked firmly to his chest, his face burning with profound, inescapable shame. He could not make eye contact with a single person in the room. Simone stared blankly at the marble floor stripped of her crimson armor and her immense, intimidating pride. Standing right by the lobby bar was Richard Montgomery, the billionaire investor who had shaken my hand earlier. He watched the family's humiliating exit with a look of profound disgust. He slowly shook his head, signaling to everyone in the room that the family's financial reputation was completely dead, before turning his back on them forever. I watched from the balcony as the authorities escorted the three of them through the massive glass revolving doors and out into the warm tropical night. I walked over to the towering windows and looked down at the resort entrance. The police cruisers and federal vehicles were lined up along the driveway, their red and blue lights flashing brilliantly against the tall palm trees. I watched the officers place Beatrice Cameron and Simone into the back of separate squad cars. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing their fate. The vehicles pulled away from the curb, speeding off into the darkness, taking the nightmare of the last 4 years away with them. The crushing weight that had lived in my chest since my husband faked his death was entirely gone. The air in my lungs felt incredibly light and clean. I turned away from the window, ready to walk back to my secure suite and hold my son. I was ready to finally breathe. But before I could take a single step toward the hallway, my phone vibrated intensely in the pocket of my silk gown. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was an urgent incoming call from my executive team back in New York. The financial war against my in-laws was over, but the flashing screen indicated there was one final, highly classified piece of business left to conclude. The morning after the arrests on the resort peninsula, I did not quietly slip out the back door of the hotel. I walked straight through the main lobby, holding my son's hand flanked by my private security team. We boarded a private jet back to the United States, leaving the smoking ruins of my in-laws' empire thousands of miles behind us. By the time our plane touched down on the tarmac in New York, the national news had completely exploded. My phone buzzed relentlessly with alerts from every major financial publication and cable news network across the country. The headlines were splashed across every screen in bright, sensational text. They read "Dead Man Found Alive in Mexico" and "Wealthy Real Estate Family Indicted in Massive $10 million Insurance Fraud Ring." The media frenzy was absolute chaos. Paparazzi and financial journalists swarmed the sidewalks outside my corporate headquarters in Manhattan, desperate for a statement from the grieving widow who had unwittingly stumbled into a federal crime. I did not give them a grieving widow. I gave them a chief executive officer. I refused to release a timid, carefully worded press statement through a public relations representative. I refused to hide in my apartment with the curtains drawn. Instead, I leaned directly into the storm. I booked one exclusive, highly orchestrated interview on the most prestigious top-tier financial television network in the country. I sat in a sleek, glass-walled broadcast studio overlooking the city skyline, wearing a razor-sharp, tailored emerald green power suit. When the camera lights clicked on, I completely controlled the entire narrative. I did not dab my eyes with a tissue. I did not speak with a trembling voice about my broken heart. I spoke with the absolute unshakable confidence of a woman who had just conquered a hostile corporate takeover. I explained to the interviewer and to the millions of viewers watching nationwide exactly how I utilized my own corporate intelligence network to uncover the massive federal fraud ring. I detailed how my legal team moved with lethal precision to freeze their offshore assets and acquire their toxic debt before they could flee international jurisdiction. I systematically dismantled the polished elite reputation my in-laws had spent decades building. I painted Trevor, Cameron, Beatrice, and Simone not as criminal masterminds, but as sloppy, desperate, and pathetic amateurs who vastly underestimated the wrong woman. The response from the business world was immediate and explosive. Wall Street absolutely loves a ruthless, unapologetic winner. Before the television interview even concluded, my biotech company's stock soared to unprecedented heights. Investors were clamoring to align themselves with a chief executive who handled deeply personal, catastrophic threats with such cold, calculated efficiency. My $80 million enterprise grew exponentially stronger overnight. The very scandal my in-laws thought would destroy my credibility became the ultimate catalyst for my absolute corporate dominance. With my professional victory cemented in the public eye, I moved swiftly to handle the most important, deeply personal piece of business remaining. The financial war was won, but I needed to completely eradicate the toxic stain of my dead husband from my son's life. I walked into the chambers of a highly respected family court judge in Manhattan, accompanied by my lead attorney. I presented the extensive documentation of Trevor's faked death, his federal fraud indictment, and his violent attempt to kidnap my child at the marina. The judge reviewed the staggering mountain of evidence with a grim, disgusted expression. He did not hesitate for a single second. With a few swift strokes of a heavy black pen, the judge signed the official decree. I legally changed my 7-year-old son's last name to Kensington, my maiden name. The judge permanently sealed the records and officially stripped Trevor of any and all parental rights, effectively terminating his existence in our family tree. I walked out of the courthouse holding the certified documents tightly against my chest. Trevor was legally erased. He was no longer a father. He was just a federal inmate waiting for a cell assignment. A month later, the thick, suffocating dust had finally settled. Trevor, Cameron, and Simone were sitting in isolated federal holding cells awaiting trial, facing decades in federal prison for their extensive list of felonies. Simone had tried to negotiate a plea deal by offering up her corporate clients, but the federal prosecutors laughed in her face. They had all the evidence they needed directly from her own recorded stairwell confession. Beatrice, however, took a different path. The arrogant, diamond-draped matriarch, who had ruled her country club social circles through intimidation, had completely crumbled under the pressure of a federal indictment. In a desperate attempt to save herself from a maximum security facility, she flipped on her own children. She provided federal agents with every single password account number and hidden ledger detailing Simone and Cameron's money laundering operations. In exchange for her complete betrayal of her family, she was granted a lighter sentence in a minimum security federal prison in upstate New York. On a crisp, bright Tuesday morning, I was sitting at my massive glass desk in my corporate office, reviewing expansion contracts. My executive assistant walked in carrying the morning mail. He placed a thick, cream-colored envelope directly in the center of my desk. I recognized the expensive textured stationery immediately. It was the exact same custom stationery Beatrice used to send out her lavish gala invitations. But this envelope did not bear a gold-embossed return address. It was stamped with the harsh black ink seal of a federal correctional facility. I picked up a silver letter opener and sliced cleanly through the top of the envelope. The handwriting inside was shaky, frantic, and barely legible, a stark contrast to Beatrice's usually flawless calligraphy. I read the 3-page letter, my expression remaining perfectly blank. Beatrice spent the first page detailing her miserable, terrifying new reality. She complained bitterly about the prison food making her ill, the scratchy uniforms irritating her skin, and how the other inmates stared at her. The arrogant queen of the resort was crying about her lack of luxury. The second page shifted to pure, desperate begging. She pleaded with me to use my vast corporate resources to set up a legal defense fund for her impending appeals. She promised she would pay me back with interest, conveniently forgetting that I had legally seized every single asset she ever owned. But it was the final paragraph that made my blood run cold. Despite everything she had done, despite faking her son's death trying to steal my child and mocking my grief for 4 years, she still believed she could manipulate me. She ended the pathetic weeping letter with the exact same toxic language she had always used to force my compliance. She wrote, "Please help me. We are family page. Please help me." We. I set the letter down on my polished glass desk. I did not throw it in the trash. I did not hand it over to my legal team. I pressed the intercom button and told my assistant to clear my entire afternoon schedule. I was going to visit a federal prison. I was going to deliver my reply in person. The drive from Manhattan to the Federal Correctional Facility in upstate New York took exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes. I spent the entire journey sitting in the back of my armored sport utility vehicle, watching the towering glass and steel skyline of the city gradually give way to barren trees and endless stretches of gray highway. I did not review corporate contracts or read financial reports on my tablet. I just sat in perfect silence, letting the reality of this final confrontation settle deep into my bones. The facility was a sprawling complex of drab concrete blocks surrounded by layers of intimidating razor wire. It looked exactly like what it was, a fortress designed to keep society's worst mistakes permanently locked away from the rest of the world. I stepped out of the vehicle, the crisp autumn air biting at my cheeks. I was wearing an immaculate, tailored white power suit that cost more than my mother-in-law had ever donated to her phony high society charities. I did not bring my legal team. I did not bring my executive assistant. I walked through the heavy security doors entirely alone. The guards at the front desk processed my identification with quiet efficiency. They seemed momentarily taken aback by my presence, as if high-profile chief executive officers in pristine white silk did not frequently visit this minimum security wing. I surrendered my phone and my designer clutch to the security locker, keeping only 2 items on my person. I kept the manipulative letter Beatrice had sent me, and I kept a single glossy photograph tucked safely into the interior pocket of my blazer. The visitation room smelled strongly of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and deep, inescapable despair. I was directed to a small metal table securely bolted to the scuffed linoleum floor. I sat down, smoothing the fabric of my trousers, and folded my hands on the cold metal surface. The room was noisy with the muffled conversations of other inmates and their families, but my focus remained completely locked on the heavy steel door at the far end of the hall. A harsh electronic buzzer sounded and the heavy door swung open. A prison guard escorted Beatrice into the room. The physical transformation was absolutely staggering. The arrogant diamond-draped matriarch who had once ruled her elite country club circles through pure intimidation and wealth was completely gone. She was wearing a baggy, faded khaki jumpsuit that hung loosely on her diminishing frame. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair had grown out, revealing inches of stark, gray roots. Her skin, deprived of expensive spa treatments and tropical vacations, looked sallow and deeply lined. She looked frail, exhausted, and utterly broken. Beatrice shuffled toward my table, her eyes darting nervously around the room before finally landing on me. When she saw my pristine white suit and the calm, unyielding expression on my face, fresh tears immediately pooled in her eyes. She sat down across from me, her hands trembling violently as she folded them on the table. She opened her mouth, her voice emerging as a desperate, rasping whisper. She started thanking me profusely for coming, launching instantly into a pathetic, weeping plea for financial rescue. She told me the prison food was making her physically ill and that she was terrified of the other inmates. She cried about how cold her cell was at night and how she could not sleep because of the constant noise. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, begging me to use my vast corporate resources to hire a new legal team for her appeals. She swore she would pay me back with interest, conveniently forgetting the absolute fact that my holding company had legally seized every single asset she ever owned to cover the debts she and Simone had accumulated. I let her cry and beg for exactly 3 minutes. I wanted to witness the full extent of her desperation. When she finally paused to catch her breath, preparing to launch into another round of manipulative excuses about how her sons had forced her into the insurance fraud, I held up one manicured hand. The simple, silent gesture stopped her dead in her tracks. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold metal table. I looked directly into the bloodshot eyes of the woman who had deliberately tried to convince the world I was insane. My voice was calm, steady, and colder than the concrete walls surrounding us. I told Beatrice she never actually saw me. I explained that she only saw a fragile girl she thought she could break a pathetic charity case she could control to feed her own massive, fragile ego. I lowered my voice to a lethal, razor-sharp whisper. I told her that all the crushing, suffocating pressure she and her toxic family put on me did not break me. It turned me into an unbreakable diamond. I smiled a genuine expression of absolute victory and leaned back in my chair. I told her that now, while I was running a global empire and raising a brilliant, happy son, she gets to spend the rest of her miserable life staring at concrete walls, knowing she put herself there. Beatrice let out a strangled, breathless sob. She reached across the table, trying to grab my hands, begging me not to leave her in this horrible place, crying out that we were family. I pulled my hands back smoothly, avoiding her desperate grasp. I reached into the interior pocket of my blazer and pulled out the single glossy photograph. I placed it face up on the table and slid it across the metal surface until it stopped right in front of her trembling fingers. It was a picture of me and Leo taken just last week. We were standing on the sun-drenched deck of my newly purchased luxury yacht, laughing brightly into the camera. We looked incredibly wealthy, fiercely happy, and totally free from the darkness she had tried to drown us in. I stood up, smoothing the front of my white blazer with absolute precision. I looked down at Beatrice, who was now weeping uncontrollably over the photograph, her tears dropping onto the glossy paper. I did not say another word. I turned on my heel and walked purposefully out of the visitation room. I did not look back as her desperate, hysterical screams echoed behind me. The heavy steel security doors clicked firmly shut, completely cutting off the sound of her miserable existence. I stepped out of the gloomy prison facility and into the bright, blinding sunlight of a beautiful autumn afternoon. The crisp air smelled like absolute freedom. I walked past the imposing razor wire fences toward my waiting armored vehicle. The driver opened the heavy door, and I saw my son safely buckled into the back seat, happily playing a video game. I climbed inside, wrapping my arms around Leo and pulling him into a tight, warm hug. He giggled, leaning his head against my shoulder. The driver put the car in gear and asked if we were heading back to our penthouse in the city. I looked out the tinted window at the sprawling prison complex shrinking in the distance. I told the driver no. There was one final destination we needed to visit before this chapter was permanently closed. The story of Paige teaches a profound lesson about the true nature of power and resilience. Often, toxic individuals will mistake our patience for weakness and our silence for submission. They use manipulation and gaslighting to build empires of illusion. However, Paige's journey proves that the ultimate superpower is not financial wealth, but the quiet, unyielding strength to endure darkness without letting it corrupt your own soul. True victory does not simply come from destroying those who sought to break you. It comes from fiercely protecting your peace and building a spectacular life entirely beyond their reach. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic people to build your own unbreakable empire? Share your story in the comments below.